Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. A Skinwalker or My Curse by Bropiated. I lived in Ronan, Montana for a short while, on a Salish Indian reservation. It was and still is the most beautiful part of the Rockies I've ever seen. I currently live and grew up in Colorado. When I first moved there, I went there to go to the Job Corps to be a diesel mechanic. It was a vocational school. When I got there, it got weird during orientation, because two of the main concerns the people expressed were, number one, don't go on the reservation at sunset or afterwards for your own safety, and two, when on the reservation, do not disrespect the land, litter, or leave anything unnatural out there. This kid named Sean was also from Colorado, and he was on the same flight I was. We became really good friends. We began to notice the natives didn't go out in the dark, and they would always stick to wherever the light was. My first full night there, I was a newbie and had to wake up at 4:30 in the morning to prepare breakfast. My first night, I was dead asleep but felt someone shaking me, saying, "Wake up, bud, it's time to wake up." I lazily crawled out of my bunk and noticed Sean was still asleep. I put on my flip-flops and peeled down the very long dorm hallway, thinking, oh, there's someone at the end. Wyatt, our door leader, was meant to wake me up. But I noticed the silhouette didn't move at all. The dorm was oddly dark. I started walking down the hall, and I felt like I was walking in mud. I got to the center room, Wyatt's room. He was dead asleep. His alarm clock read 3:08 a.m. It's still probably 75 feet from me. Then I started to walk back with my eyes glued on it. I got back to my doorway, and I swear to God, I heard sprinting, and I saw something sprinting towards me the second I passed the threshold for my door. The moment I froze, the stomping sound stopped. Suddenly, I flew back across the hall out of nowhere, maybe 10 feet. I couldn't even scream. I got up and tried to wake up Sean, but it wasn't happening, so I just clambered back into my bed, shaking. Later, I woke up to Wyatt actually waking me. I was confused. Was it a dream? Come to find out, nobody left their beds after 12. After 4 months, I noticed that it was haunted as fuck. The reservation and lake trail had started on the other side of the creek. It separated the campus from it. I was sleeping with this Salish native who grew up down the road. We liked to go out there and sit by the lake and watch the otters. But she'd never stay out long enough for the sun to touch the mountains. She would just freak out and we would have to go. One day, Sean was out there with us, and we were just smoking cigarettes and skipping rocks. It was a truly beautiful place. My girl looked to our left and saw a deer unusually close to us, kind of like it hadn't noticed us. She started chanting in Salish tongue and started to panic. Then out of nowhere, she started crying, bawling. She started screaming, "Run!" She bolted off. Me and Sean stood up, confused. But there was something about that deer. It stared at us, not just at us, but like it was looking at our souls. We both started feeling really uneasy, tried to scare it off, but it wouldn't move. We then noticed the sun was at the mountains, and we started walking back. The deer followed us, maybe 15 feet behind. Probably less. We started picking up the pace. Then we saw a raven sitting on a fence post not 4 feet away on the trail. It cawed, and the deer was gone, but we should have seen it take off, right? No, it just vanished. We had a mile left. We really fucked up. It got weird and it got foggy, so we couldn't really see more than, 20 feet. But then we heard and saw it, and we smelled something like a dead animal. Off to the left of the trail, we heard what sounded like tearing and breaking. Being ballsy white boys in good shape, We made a few steps over to make out a figure with no clothes on the ground and antlers. "Josh, that's a deer," Sean whispered. And we just looked at the thing tearing at it. We started walking backwards, eyes locked on this thing. Sean tripped on a rock and quietly said, "Ouch." It was too quiet, though. Whatever it was stopped doing what it was doing, as if it was listening for us. Maybe it could hear us breathing, I don't know. The thing stood up. Its legs were really long and skinny. I mean, I'm telling you, it was on 2 fucking legs. The arms folded down abnormally long. The first thing that came to my mind was the ice cream man from the movie Legion. It didn't have any clothes, and its head turned our way. The jaw and mouth, normal, but it smiled. And I'm not fucking around. It waved at us. Pure terror. And we bolted. I mean, we sprinted and did not stop. It sounded like the world was ending behind us. The cracking, the creeping, the bushes rustling. And we didn't look back. When we got close enough to others, we started screaming for help, and some of the staff rushed out to meet us. We both cried in our instructor's arms for a good half hour, and as we connected with them in our sprint, they too saw a taller, skinny man chasing us. Then they saw it dart off to the left, into the dark and fog. My girl was there too. She knew what we saw. Hell, they all did. Come to find out, if you lived on that land, you've seen him. They call him a skinwalker. He appears as something you normally find pleasing, but then twisted into fear to get your flesh. I never went back out there again, but I did sit on the other side of the creek and watch, and I know we were watching each other. An abandoned jockey truck at CB7, submitted by Painkiller. Before I became an over-the-road truck driver, I worked at the state docks on third shift. In case you don't know, I've worked the third shift by myself for about the first 6 months on the job because nobody obviously wanted to work at night. I can't honestly say that I really blame them. On this particular occasion, I had finally gotten someone to work with me. He had started the week before this happened, and with that out of the way, here's my story. I arrived at work at about 10:45 p.m. as I usually did. There was nothing particularly special about this night other than it was raining. It was about the end of November, and it had started to finally cool off in Georgia, and we were all thankful for that. Even though it had started to cool off, it was still somewhat humid, and if you're at all unfamiliar with our winter season here, the cold has a bite to it because of the humidity. This was a Friday night, and before I left my Thursday night shift on Friday morning at 8 a.m., I was told that for Saturday morning dispatch, we had 49 trucks ordered to work. However, when me and my coworker Ryan came in that Friday night, we learned that the 2 ships had canceled the dispatch. We were both like, cool, we can just service what comes in later and then just take our time. There were only 28 trucks that needed to be serviced, but being the third shift lead tech, I had a few other things to do with servicing the trucks. No big deal. As per usual, all the trucks came in just after midnight, so we parked them. There were only 27 trucks that came in. Well, that's strange, I thought to myself. I wonder where it's at. So I went into the dispatch office and got all the truck and trailer numbers that I had dispatched that morning. And I was most definitely missing a truck and a trailer. I had to go and find this missing unit because I could be held responsible if something happened to it, or if it was involved in an accident. I walked over to Ryan and told him to go ahead and start servicing the truck, and to make sure he wrote down the hours correctly from the meter inside the trucks. I told them that I had to go and find this truck and trailer, wherever it was, and get it back to the yard. He then asked me, "How long before you come back?" It was kind of an odd question, but I answered, well, that depends on where the truck is, if it cranks or not, and if I can move it. Why? He told me he wasn't feeling well. I looked at him and asked him, then why did you come to work? He mumbled something, and I just told him to go ahead and go on home. Ryan left just before I left the yard, and I had no expectations of seeing him until Saturday night. So I got into a jockey truck that we had welded a boom arm onto that we can pick up a jockey truck and trailer it and pull it back to the yard if it was unable to start or release the brakes or was in some type of catastrophic accident that required my full attention to move it and clean up the area where it happened. Just as I had left the gate of our yard, I got a call from the port police. They asked me if I was missing a truck and trailer, and of course I told them, yes I am. The officer then told me where I could find it, and then he told me that there was also yet another truck in the same general area. I thought, great, now I'm totally fucked. The hits just keep on coming with this damn job. Not only did I now have to service 28 trucks, I also had a truck that I couldn't find at first look. I also had to get the hours on every single truck at this port, and I also had to drive about 20 minutes to the next port and get the hours on the trucks from that location. I didn't like to put off something till tomorrow that I can do today, so I chose to get them all done in one night. This was obviously not going to happen tonight. Anyway, I'm in the tow truck and driving out to the dock to check on this abandoned truck and trailer. The port has a speed limit of 25 miles an hour, but since there's not supposed to be anyone else but me and the port police on the port, I drove that tow truck with my foot buried in the floor. This particular jockey truck tow truck was able to do about 47 miles an hour when she was wide open. That doesn't sound like a lot, I know, but it's pretty damn brutal when the jockey truck has 63,000-pound leaf springs in the front and no suspension in the rear, so you could end up pissing blood for a week because it would bruise your kidneys. That particular place this abandoned truck and trailer was about 5 miles from our service yard, and as soon as I cleared the container stacks, I could see way off to my left flashing blue and red lights. I turned and headed in that direction. When I finally arrived at the truck about 2 minutes later, the cop asked me what I knew about the truck. I told him, well, all I know is I dispatched it this morning. Didn't come back with the other truck that were working this vessel. I also told him that I had no idea where it was before they called me about it. It was peculiar because the vessel was at CB2, or Container Berth 2, and this truck was obviously a few football fields away from the ship. After that brief exchange with the officer, I got to work checking the truck to determine what was wrong with it and why it was left abandoned on the dock. I tried to work as quickly as possible because, like I stated before, it was raining. I checked all of the fluid levels and saw nothing on the ground. I knew that the truck was safe to try and start, and it started right up. It had obviously been sitting for a few hours by the time I got to it, so I had to wait for the air pressure to build up before I attempted to move it. While I was waiting for that, I began to scan the area for the other truck that I was told was in the same general area. I didn't immediately see that truck, so I kind of put it in the back of my mind. Just as the cab airbag started to level the cab, I spotted someone walking behind a container stack. The port police officer had left about 10 minutes before, so I knew it wasn't him. I knew that all the longshoremen were gone, and so were the stevedores. Nobody else should have been anywhere near where I was. Port police did some rounds at night every couple hours or so, but this truck was reported to the third shift officers by the second shift in a report. I shut off the abandoned truck and jumped back into the tow truck and headed to the container stack where I had seen the person disappear. I was running the truck full tilt as fast as she would go, and by the time I got there, I saw him from my peripheral vision walking between two containers and another stack. There's about 60 feet that separate the container stacks, and this is the same for all the stacks, no matter where they were on this particular spot. So I drove to where I had seen him walk to once again. My tow truck was fitted with spotlights on the back and both sides for when I was working at night, so I turned them on. It's really easy to make your way in between containers without being seen, and whoever was doing this used that to their advantage. It was also easy to hear me coming because the diesel engine of the tow truck was so loud. For the next 20 minutes or so, this guy kept eluding me in my tow truck. It was about then that I noticed it was already 3:15 a.m., and I couldn't stay out there anymore trying to track this guy down. So I went back to the abandoned truck, hooked it up to my tow truck, picked it up off the ground, got back in and started it and released the brakes. I still remember that I had another abandoned truck in the same area and drove down to the end of CB7 to see if I could find it. I drove along the chain link fence that separated CB7 for the then under construction CB8. In doing so, I looked to my left and was looking down the container stacks to see if I could find the other missing truck. I didn't know anything about it other than the cop that reported it to me, that it was quote-unquote in the same general area. Definitely not a lot of help. As I was driving and looking with my spotlights, I saw the truck. It was totally not in the general area. The container stacks are really dark at night, so I approached it very carefully. That is very hard to do when I have two diesel engines running at the same time. It's even harder to stay quiet when I have the spitter valves blowing off excess air from the air tanks as well. Just as I got to within about 100 yards of the missing truck, I noticed that the lights were on because I could see the red lights on top of the headache rack. I didn't know if the truck was running or had run out of fuel, but I was about to find out. I guess I was about 40 yards away when the truck started to move. "What the fuck?" I said out loud to myself. "This is not good." I called the port police immediately and told them that I found the truck and there is an unauthorized person driving it. They dispatched 2 cars and I told them I was following the truck and where I was. This person, whoever he was, had gotten a considerable distance ahead of me since I was way down pulling another truck and trailer behind me. I was going as fast as I could given the circumstances, and just as I was coming to about the last mile to my service yard, here come the 2 police cruisers in my mirror, probably doing about 60. I reached the last curve before the yard and saw the person in the now stolen truck drive up to the service area and power slide the truck by pulling out the parking brakes, jumping out of the truck, and bolting away towards the fence. Then, before I made it to the gate, the 2 cruisers screamed past me and stopped at the truck, got out and drew their weapons. The person had run towards a gate that was locked after 4 p.m. The fence was 8 feet tall and had barbed wire and razor wire all around the top. And I had finally made it into the service area and shut down the tow truck. Then, 3 more cruisers came blasting into the yard, and one of the officers told me to stay in the truck in the well-lit area of the service bay. I did as I was told. After what felt like eternity, I heard the officers yelling at someone to "Get out on the fucking ground!" And a couple of minutes later, they were dragging a man out of the shadows that was covered in dirt and bleeding. They asked me if this was the guy I saw driving the truck, and I told them I never got a look at his face, but if that is the guy you caught, then I'm pretty sure he's the guy. All I could tell was that he was bald and was wearing a pair of coveralls. They escorted him to one of the cruisers and put him in the back seat. Then one of the officers said, "We found this knife on him. Did you see he had it?" I told them that I was unsure if he did, in fact, have any weapon on him because I didn't see it. I'm not really sure what he had in mind carrying that thing around. It was definitely not a pocket knife. It looked more like a hunting knife with a fixed blade to me. The port police asked me if I wanted to press charges, and of course I said yes. I told them to charge him with whatever they could. Not sure what that was all about, but apparently it didn't stick because he got out and returned to his job with the Longshoremen's Hall about a month later, and he had the nerve to show up at my window to be assigned to truck and trailer. I refused to dispatch him and had the port police remove him from the property. The longshoreman's pit license was revoked, and then he lost his port credentials. This forced him out of a job. He never returned to my dispatch window the remainder of the time that I worked there. When I came into work that next Saturday night, I told Ryan what had happened the night before. He was always kind of a nervous guy, and I'm glad he wasn't on the yard when this happened. He would have probably gotten hurt pretty bad. He wasn't one of those people who kept calm under pressure or in a situation like that. If he had been there, I'm going to bet that that would have been his last night, but they made me lead tech for a reason. Along with the port police report I had to submit to the office, I had to submit my own report as well. And no, this is absolutely not the last creepy story from my time working third shift at the port. I've got more to come. The Strange Man, submitted by Anonymous. My name isn't important, and I assure you that I am stable and sane. Let me tell you what happened to me a few years ago. I started a job as a waitress, my first time doing that kind of job. It was an old restaurant opened under new management. The owner was in his 30s and seemed nice. I showed up for work, and he sat me at a table and told me to relax and just watch him work while he brought me a plate of food. Steak burger with fries, I think. There was no uniform, so I probably looked like a customer. The place wasn't busy, and the layout was an L-shaped dining room. The door was to my right, and there was a wall that ran halfway down the room, creating the long side of the L, and a bar against the far wall. There wasn't a bartender, as it was a Wednesday night, and I watched the owner greet customers while I watched him as he sat them on the other side of the wall and just ate my food. About 9 o'clock, I walked over to him as he sat reading some papers. I placed my hand on his shoulder, and he jumped and spun around with a look of terror on his face. I felt so bad, and wondered if he was one of those people that were afraid of being touched. I apologized profusely for startling him, and asked if there was anything I could do. I felt so bad about doing basically nothing all night long. The owner looked at his watch, told me to just stand there, and man the front door. Then he walked past the bar and into an unmarked door that he had mentioned during the tour was just a storeroom. After a few minutes of waiting, a thin, gray-haired, nondescript man entered the restaurant. I smiled. He was my first customer. "Follow me," I said, as I walked to the other side of the dining room that only had 4 tables with diners. I turned to the left about 5 feet to offer him a seat at a small table or a lunch counter of sorts that was empty. He was still walking straight, making for the back corner of the dining room, and I thought, I didn't ask if he was meeting anyone. As I took a few steps towards him, he disappeared. I kid you not, he disappeared. There weren't any potted plants to step behind or anything else to shield him from view. He literally disappeared. I made a beeline for the storeroom, trying not to run. I just rushed in and shut the door behind me. The owner was standing in the storeroom, nothing in his hands, just looking at me. I wasn't certain how to start, but I blurted out, "A man just disappeared as I was showing him to his table." He stared at me and said nothing at first. Then he cleared his throat. Did he say anything? I stopped and thought for a moment and said, "No." He just said, "Okay," and calmly walked out the door and back to where he was sitting at the bar before. I grabbed my purse and left. Creepy Uber Story, submitted by Nick B. Here's my story. I'm a 28-year-old male, and this happened a year ago, prior to me typing this story out. I first started driving for Uber back in November 2017 after being without a job for several months, and the job market where I used to live was terrible. I figured beggars couldn't be choosers. Starting out, I thought Uber was cool, making your own hours and money driving around. It does take a toll on you, though, when you drive full-time and hell on your car. As a side note, Uber is a waste of time and not worth the money. I was hanging out at my buddy's cell phone store, shooting the shit with him and waiting for a call to come in. I received a ping going to the local hospital, so I hopped in my car and started making my way there. About a minute into my drive, the customer called and told me that he is at the emergency room. I acknowledged and continued on my way. I pulled up to the ER, and a security guard came up to me and said, "Uber?" I said, "Yes." She motioned for my customer to come over, and he was a short, chubby, bald man, probably in his mid-30s. I'm not really good at telling age these days. The man hopped in my car, and he seemed normal. He was telling me how he was at the ER for anxiety, and the people in there were thinking he was on drugs. I was like, okay, I get that. I've been in the hospital for anxiety myself. As we were making our way out of the parking lot, the man said, "Hey, are you on the phone with the cops?" I said, "No, sir." And a moment later, he was like, "Sir, can we go to the McDonald's in Sylvester?" First off, I'll go ahead and say that I used to live in the shithole town of Albany, Georgia, for any of you guys that might know of that town. Anyway, Sylvester is a town 30 minutes away from Albany. I said, "Sir, there's a McDonald's right down the road." And he said, "No, I want to go to the one in Sylvester because I am out of their jurisdiction." At this point, I'm like, no wonder these people at the hospital thought he was on drugs. The dude's on drugs, or he's just fucking nuts. Now I'm thinking, fuck. Luckily, his destination was the Hilton in downtown Albany, about 3 or 4 minutes from where I picked him up. I started to tell him, "Hey, let me take you to your hotel first, and then I'll take you to McDonald's." Once again he asked, "Are you on the phone with the cops?" I replied, "No." Alright, this guy is delusional, so I'm thinking he probably has no idea what's going on. I start to pull up to the hotel, and I'm like, "Okay, here we are, sir." And he says, "You can pull up to the canopy." I pull up, and he hops out very quickly, and I nope the fuck out of there. I'm like, hotel staff, he's your problem now. Which I do feel kind of bad for them, as I used to work front desk, too. I now work for a utility company far the fuck away from shitty Albany, Georgia. The perfect job for an introvert like me in a cubicle. I just look at plates all day. Crazy bald guy? Let's not meet again. Don't trust everyone you meet. Submitted by Ernie Ball Fan. I apologize for this being so long. You can edit and cut it down if you feel like it, but I hope you read it. In the late 90s, I found myself without a place to stay. It was of my own doing, but when you find out that your wife of 5 years has been cheating on you, and your only recourse is to leave, well, that's the way it is. I was living in New York City at the time, trying to make a living as a musician, both original songwriter and studio work. My wife and I had gone to college together, and had been together for 3 of the 4 years that we attended. We stayed together after graduation for another 3 before deciding to get married. As I mentioned, everything finally went south. She ended up sleeping with a few different guys and then threw it in my face that I was never home with her. Let me just say that being a musician or being married to a musician is not the easiest thing in the world. Your hours are crazy, you're always at music venues or bars or working in a studio at odd hours to fill the needs of whoever is asking you to be there. I was, and by no means am, a super famous musician that a lot of your listeners would recognize. But I can say that probably some of them have heard my work somewhere or another, whether on a record album or in a commercial. I still do it for a living, and I enjoy a decent lifestyle. Okay, that has nothing to do with the story, but I suppose it gives a little backstory. When I found out my wife was cheating on me, I obviously was devastated and realized that I needed to get out. What she had done was way beyond forgiveness, and I made the right decision then and there to walk away. The problem was, our place in Brooklyn was in her name, and there wasn't much I could do about getting the lease turned over to me. After many days and nights of fighting and yelling, I just picked up and left. Thank God we didn't have kids. Eventually we did sort things out, but this story is about my travel to the West Coast, and what happened to me on the way. One morning, I decided that since all my commitments at the studios had been taken care of, and I had no gigs lined up, I simply packed up all my gear in my blazer, wrote a fuck you letter to my now ex-wife, and I started my drive to LA. I stopped in Pittsburgh to see some friends and told them what was happening with me and my ex, and I stayed with them for a couple of days. I should mention I was 28 at the time, so kind of young but also pretty street smart and knowing what time it was. I figured I'd try to see if there was a way for me to make some money on the road to help out with my personal bank account that I was going to be relying on for quite some time. So I stayed in Pittsburgh. My friends hooked me up with a couple of places that I could play for a few bucks. After those couple of days, I finally made my way out, and I got to a little town in Indiana. It's an area that I will not mention for very obvious reasons. When I got there, it was kind of late, I was tired and hungry. So I decided to stop there for the night. Found a place that had rooms to rent, as there were no hotels in town. I mean, this place was the epitome of bumfuck nowhere. In the daylight hours, I would find out that there was nothing but farming. A small manufacturing facility, a couple of diners, restaurants, and bars, but that was about it. Honestly, the biggest form of entertainment in the town was a roller skating rink. That gives you an idea of where I was. So after I got my stuff in my room, I decided to walk down the main street where really that's the only thing that seemed to be open. Oh, fuck, there was nothing else to be open. I went to this bar and grill, sat down at the bar and ordered a beer. The bartender was this really nice guy around my age and asked if I wanted something to eat, and I said yeah, so he got me a menu. I just started doing the whole, hey, where are you from? What are you doing here kind of a conversation. That always seems to happen in the little towns when a stranger rides in. I gave him the fast version of my country western song, as I called it, and he laughed and said, yeah, that kind of sucks. I kind of know how you feel. My brother went through something similar right here in town, and he doesn't live here anymore. He moved down south to get away from his wife. When he asked if I was going to stay the night, I said, I'd really like to see if I could pick up a temp job for a couple of days and maybe make some more cash. I asked him, you know anybody around here that would hire somebody as an extra hand for a day or so? He said some of the farmers were always looking for guys and that he could ask around with some of them who he knew would be coming in later that night. We got to talking music, and I told him that that's what I did for a living, and he just said, no shit. And he said, once in a while we do live music here, but it's so far from a lot of other places, it's hard to get guys to come out in the middle of nowhere where we are. He asked what I played, and I told him, and he said, seriously? And I said, yeah, and he said, you up for an audition? I think I might be able to solve your problem. So basically, I ran back to my truck, grabbed one of my acoustics from its locked case, and walked back to the place. There wasn't a lot of people there yet. It was a Thursday night. But I'll never forget, I played him a Hank Williams Jr. tune, a Tom Petty tune, and then a slower Garth Brooks tune, the one that's called Somewhere Other Than the Night. He just looked at me and said, well, I'll be damned, you weren't kidding. A couple of the other people that were there shooting pool had stopped and listened, and they also clapped. The bartender, who I'll call Russ for this story, said, I tell you what, tomorrow night you can play here. I've got an old speaker system and some microphones, and I'll give you 3/4 of what I get at the door. If it works out and you feel like it, come back on Saturday night for the same thing. I just looked at him, and he said, does that sound good? I was blown away. I couldn't believe how nice this guy was being and how perfect this was working out. I told him, honestly, 3/4 of the door is a lot, and he said, hey, don't worry, you know where you are. I think you can imagine how much people drink around here. I'll do fine at the bar. I asked him how many people he could get in there, and he said, between 150 and 200. My joint's the only one that stays open past 11. I did some mental math and figured if he was charging like $3 at the door, I could clear like $600. For 2 nights' work back in a place like that and I'd never been, I thought that was pretty good. It got to be around 11, and I was even more tired, but figured I'd have one more beer, and some of the other locals had been filtering in and saw my guitar next to me and asked if I was playing. Russ just looked at him and said, not tonight, but tomorrow you gotta come back and hear this guy. They said, is he any good? Russ just nodded and said, yeah, I think he's real good. They just gave me another look like I was from another planet, and said, all right, and wandered back to the pool tables. Russ and I worked out a deal that I would go on at 9:30, play for an hour or so, take a short break, and then play another set as long as I wanted to. We shook hands, and I said I couldn't thank him enough for this hospitality, and he just said, no, you know what? It's nice to have someone from not around here, and the fact that you can play some music for all of us country boys is really great. I was on cloud 9. I walked back to my room, went through a few of my old songbooks I had brought with me to try to remember some of the tunes that I had played, because I wanted to do more country stuff and not as many originals, obviously. I finally went to sleep and slept great. The next morning, I got showered, went back downtown and found a greasy spoon for some breakfast, and saw that Russ had put up a sign in the window of his place that said live music tonight. I smiled and thought that was really cool. After breakfast, I went and got a haircut, and it seemed like everybody knew that I didn't belong there and was wondering who I was by the way they were looking at me. Things were going cool at this point, but they were to take a creepy turn pretty quick. That night I went to the bar, and Russ had set up some small PA speakers and had 2 microphones. I adjusted one for my guitar, one for my Vox, and I ran them through this really old amplifier that I was sure was not going to work. But when I started strumming and singing and playing around with the mix, it didn't sound too bad. He gave me a thumbs up from the bar, and I was ready to go right at 9:30. It was a good time. I was nervous at first because of a different crowd, but as more and more people came in, the more I relaxed and just got into a groove. People kept coming up and requesting songs I didn't know, and they just kept saying, "Well, you can play them when you come back next time." It honestly was just like that line out of the Blues Brothers, and it made me smile, like I was going to come back to this place after I got to California. During my first break, a woman came over to me and said, "Hey, I really like how you sound," and introduced herself as Lynn. Oh boy, let me tell you about Lynn. She was very cute and very nice, but very flirtatious, and I noticed that straight away she wanted all of my attention. That should have been a red flag. We talked for a while before I had to go back up, and she said, "Maybe we can talk when you're done." I said, "Sure." I mean, what else was I going to say? So I went back up and played for another hour and a half with more requests and songs I didn't know. I wrapped up and the place was closing at 1, so Russ and I squared up money, and he was 100% straight with me. He gave me $350. I've played a lot of gigs before and after this, and for a middle-of-a-nowhere joint to hand over that kind of money in the 90s was unheard of. There were gigs that I had played locally and weekly in New York that I didn't get that much money for one night's work, but I wasn't complaining. So I think you can see where this story might be going now when I say that Lynn came back over to talk to me some more, and we had a couple of beers as things were winding down and people were leaving. Russ said, "Hey, offer's open, man. You want to come back tomorrow?" I said, "Sure." Lynn asked me if I would walk her home as she usually had someone do that, and why wouldn't it be me? I did, and of course my hormones took over when I realized what she was looking for all along. I spent the night with her and got up in the morning to leave, and she asked if I wanted to get together again later that night. I said, "Sure, I gotta play first, but that'd be cool if you came back." In the back of my mind, I was thinking I might just get my money and get on the road, even though it would be late. I tried to remember some of the songs people asked me to play when I went back to my room, but before I could do that, I walked past my truck to get another guitar out. I couldn't help but notice that there were not one, but 2 dead skunks on the hood and windshield of my truck. It smelled fucking awful. Town was so small, it didn't have a car wash or anything like that. But as I drove around looking, I went past a farm where I saw a guy using a power washer on some equipment. I pulled up, I asked him if I could use his for $20, and he was really cool. Said, "Sure, and I can help you." He had some heavy-duty cleaner that he had dumped on my truck, and I sponged it around trying to get the smell gone, and I cleaned up everything else, too. I mean, it worked pretty good, but that smell is so hard to get out. He asked, "How the hell did that happen?" I said, "I don't know. I came out to my truck this morning and saw that they were there." He shook his head and said, "Man, that's a damn shame." We shook hands, exchanged names, I gave him the $20, and I thanked him over and over again, and he said, "No, that's all right." And then I went back to my room. Later, I went out to get another bite to eat, and when I went back to my room, once again I noticed something wrong with my truck. 2 of the tires were deflated, and there were some words in the dust that had already been kicked up onto the tailgate. It just said, "Get out while you can." Like a moron, I limped the truck up the street to the only gas station in town, and they helped me fill my truck tires with air. After that, I drove to the small parking lot next to the bar and left it there after getting my guitars out and taking them to my room. I figured if I left it there, more people would see it, and whoever was fucking with it wouldn't be so bold to do it in a populated area. And then again, when I say populated, I mean somebody walking by every 15 minutes or so. That night again was great. I made another $300, shook hands with Russ and a bunch of people from the town who were really nice to me and said, "You know, I may be back someday." A bunch of people asked where I was headed, and I told them my story, and they wished me good luck. Lynn was there, of course, and I went home with her again, of course, being the idiot that I was. We had sex again, and sometime a couple of hours later, I heard a noise in her bedroom, which was a house in a little shady street off the main drag. I thought it was just her getting up. Nope. To be honest, I never even got or saw these guys' faces. I was dragged off the bed, slammed down onto the floor, and immediately got pummeled. I mean, this was an ass-kicking of a lifetime. I was kicked in the head, in the back, God, even in my ass, everywhere. While I kept yelling, "Stop! Stop! What the hell?" I was dragged out of the bedroom, cracked my head on the doorframe, and was dragged into the living room, where there was a lamp on in the corner. The two guys stood over me and said, "We told you to get out, or else. Now you better fucking do it, boy." One guy plunged a knife right into the floor next to the side of my head. I nearly shit myself. Throughout all of this, I looked over and noticed that Lynn was calmly sitting on a couch not 5 feet from me, watching. The two guys turned around quickly and left me there bleeding, and I rolled over onto my side away from the knife. I looked up at her and said, "What the fuck was that?" She just lit up a cigarette, looked at me and said, "Oh, that's my ex-boyfriend. He gets a little jealous." I looked back at her and said, "You're not going to fucking help me? And you're fine with them kicking the shit out of me?" I'm not making this up. She just shrugged and said, "Well, not much I can do. Every time I go to the police, they just let him go." And again, I'm not lying. And to this day, I swear to God, I heard her mutter under her breath, but loud enough for me to hear, "At least he didn't kick my ass tonight." I went to the bathroom and saw my face was swelling up, but didn't have any teeth missing. Outside of the cut on my head from banking it off the door, I knew I would heal up, and I only suffered a bunch of bruises. I knew I was going to be sore the next day. Guys were pretty smart. Didn't leave any serious marks. But then again, who the fuck was I going to go to and report this? I just grabbed my stuff, walked out the door without even saying anything to Lynn, as she just sat there smoking. Went back to my room, took another shower, left the money I owed for the next day, and then went out to my truck at the bar. There was another truck blocking it in, and my heart sank. As I walked up to it, I couldn't see in the window, so I just put my clothes and stuff in the front seat of mine, not caring to pack it properly. I didn't even look over when I heard the window roll down on the passenger side of the truck behind me. In the same voice that I'd heard in Lynn's living room, they just said, "Good choice. Get out." The truck backed up and I didn't say another word, just got into my blazer and started making my way down this main street before stopping to check my map. I knew I had to travel a little bit before finding another crossroad to get me back onto the interstate, and that truck followed me all the way down the street and stopped right behind me when I parked. When I figured out where I had to go, I got out of town and the road widened a little bit, but that truck stayed right on my ass for a mile or two outside of town. Then it pulled up alongside me and started doing that jerking motion over towards me like they were going to try to run me off the road. But they didn't quite do it. They came pretty damn close. I was freaking out. How long were these guys going to follow me? Were they going to wait until we were far out of town, knock me off the road, and kill me? Fuck, I wasn't putting anything out of my mind at that point. Finally, I got to the crossroads of where I needed to go, so I slowed down, hit my turn signal, but the truck stayed on the side of me, and then a bunch of beer cans hit the hood of my truck, and I heard them laughing. When I made the turn, the truck, thank God, didn't follow me, and I got back on the interstate with no problem. I drove until noon the next day, wanting to put as many miles behind me of that town as I could. I didn't mean this story to be one about getting down on a little hick town, because I've played a lot of them, and I've played in much hairier and scarier neighborhoods all through California, the Midwest, and the Southwest. Hell, that place made some places in Chicago look like heaven. A lot of places are scarier than that, but at the time of my life, it was by far the most terrified I had ever been. I mean, even after the beating, I could not get it out of my head that they were going to do something else when we finally got out on the open road. Just goes to show you, no matter where you go, there are really great people and there are really bad people. It's not like they're all living in one area. It's been nearly 30 years since that happened, and I've actually written 2 songs about it. I still play professionally, Never really did make it big, but I made a name for myself out there too, and I'm making a very nice living. Once in a while, I'll even play one of those songs that I wrote. But when I do look back, I still have so many thoughts bouncing around in my head. I mean, what if I had put up more of a fight? What if I hadn't have left that town right away? Would anyone really have helped me if I had gotten really messed up? I mean, I don't want to be overly dramatic, but I honestly think there was a possibility that I might just have disappeared out in the middle of nowhere. I guess the moral of the story is, don't be so trusting, even when other people are treating you well. No matter where you go, there's always a snake in the grass. Scary Camping Trip, submitted by Shay. Last May, I went on a camping trip with one of my friends who I've known since 7th grade for 2 reasons. One being that her and her family always go to this camping trip every summer, and the other reason being that we were graduating high school. It was at a campsite in Colfax, California, by the Bear River, which was in walking distance of the river and was surrounded by breathtaking landscapes. To get to our site, we had to drive up a somewhat windy road that took us right to a small parking lot, which directly faced our site and was connected by a little bridge with a creek running underneath. When me and my friend Sam arrived, her mom and her friends had already set up their tents and were chilling at a table playing a card game while eating snacks and playing some country music. We got to our spot and saw a man and a woman a few sites away from us, but we could tell they weren't supposed to be there. You see, in order to stay at these campsites, you have to pay to stay at each site, and I don't mean to sound like I'm making false assumptions about people, but it was obvious that they weren't supposed to be there, as they looked like they hadn't showered in a while, and were going to sleep in a hammock between 2 trees, in spite of how cold it got at night. Plus, the man had a small but what looked like a very sharp machete that he was using to cut down some of the bushes and little trees over by where they were. Me and Sam actually didn't think much of it at first, but her mom and her mom's friend came over to us and talked about how, it didn't seem like they belonged there. We didn't want to interfere with them. In other words, go over there and tell them to get the hell out. So, later on, the 4 of us drove down to a beach area to just chill at the river. As we were driving, we saw the park ranger driving our way. So Sam's mom stopped the ranger and told him about the people by our site, and how they could be in a site that other people had already paid for. Plus, the guy had a freaking machete cutting down trees and stuff as if he was an Indiana Jones. The ranger thanked her for letting him know, and that he would go take care of it. Relieved of the worry that random people with a machete were no longer going to be there, we went to the beach, sat in our chairs in the water, and just sat back, talked, and watched the absolutely gorgeous view of all the forestry around us, as well as the cold blue water steadily rushing by. Everything was peaceful, until the next day, Saturday. Sam and I were sitting at our table playing Yahtzee and listening to our beloved underground rap music, and this huge RV pulled up in the parking lot. This Australian couple came out and talked to Sam's mom and her friends. It seemed to be a very nice couple who were taking a trip across the U.S. But of course, being the spooky person I am, thought, what if they were actually campsite murderers that befriend people around them and then slaughter them in their sleep? I told my friend that, and she said she was thinking the same thing. We both laughed and joked about it for a little bit, knowing that the seemingly crazy conspiracy might just have been true. After the couple went back to their RV, my suspicions of them still stuck in my mind, but faded as nighttime came upon us. Another couple set up camp where the other 2 had put their hammock the day before. Sam and I set up our own campfire. We ate dinner, roasted marshmallows, and talked about high school. It was finally coming to an end, and we were talking about the future. All of a sudden, Sam looks as she was facing the small bridge and said, "What the hell?" So I turn around and see the same man from the day before that was there with his girlfriend, walking over the bridge, passing by us to the new couple, who were also at the time eating their dinner by their bonfire. Strangely enough, the guy walked up to the couple, sat by the fire, and they gave him a plate of food. They conversed for about half an hour while the man ate. Sam and I were confused as to where that guy's girlfriend was. She was nowhere in sight, and why he had gone straight to that couple. Sam's mom walked up to us and was also confused as to why he was there again, and wondered how that he and the couple knew each other. The whole vibe was really weird, to say the least, so Sam's mom offered to move our tent to where her mom and her friends' tents were. We insisted everything was okay. Her mom walked back over to their table, and the guy walked back to his notably red truck, still with no girlfriend in sight, and he just drove down the road. This is where things really get weird. I watched him go down the road. However, I saw that the taillights blinked, indicating that he had stopped in the middle of the road. Might I add, the road was pitch black and added to the creepiness, so I just said, "Did you see that?" And Sam said, "No, what happened?" I told her that he had stopped in the middle of the road, and she was also like, "What the fuck?" I never saw him drive away, but apparently he did, because about 10 minutes later, he slowly drove back up to the parking lot, stopped his car towards our direction, then turned around and then drove down the road. Sam and I looked at each other again like, "What the fuck?" And she said, "Did you guys see that?" And she was talking to her mom and friends, and they said they did see it. A few minutes later, he did the same thing. Slowly drove up, briefly stopped his truck, and then drove back down the road. He kept doing that every 10 or 20 minutes, and that conspiracy that me and Sam thought about came back to haunt us. Now she was freaking out, and I was kind of laughing it off, but I got to admit I was getting a little anxious. My body even showed it because my fingertips and toes had gotten super cold, which always happens when I get anxious. Then, of course, here he comes again. But this time he stayed on the road, stopped his truck, and then drove up the road opposite to where he usually went. What made it even worse was that it may have been dark on that road, but we were equipped with flashlights and had a few fires going on, so we could see the roadway in front of us and the parking lot, just not so much of the stretch of the road that he had gone down. With that being said, we could see this guy staring directly at us while driving by with a bunch of crap in the back of his truck. Again, no girlfriend. Sam stayed on the question of where the hell the girlfriend went, as we hadn't seen her all day since the day before. Apparently, the husband of Sam's mom's friend had a gun somewhere, so we felt a bit safer with him around. Plus, Sam's mom's boyfriend at the time had a few baseball bats to hit some balls with if needed. Even with all the protection we had, and the projection that the guy wasn't actually going to do anything, I still felt super creeped out and teared up a little. The thought that we weren't going to leave that place alive the next day. Sam's mom and her friend came over and told us that they too were getting freaked out and offered to take us home, but we ended up just staying the night. We did move our tent closer to Sam's mom's tent to feel safer. As we were doing that, though, this guy, of course, drives up, drives away again, which indeed made us further worry. I wish I was as chill about it as Sam, but nope. During the night, I kept listening to those noises around us and tried to fall asleep. However, I was scared awake to the point that I had sat straight up with my eyes wide open and heard the noise of two fishermen walking down a path that led to a little fishing spot. However, I swore I heard that truck driving on the road once or twice. After a while of calming myself down, I fell back asleep and woke up at around 6 or 7 when everyone else was already awake. While we ate breakfast and just chilled, the strange guy drove up and away again, and Sam's mom's friend had told us that he had been doing that ever since they first got up, which led us to believe that there was a good chance he had been doing it all night as well. So, we packed up all of our stuff after me and Sam explored down a path and found a cool hidden beach spot. While we were driving down the road to leave, the guy was driving his red truck again up the road to our site. As we passed by him, He glared straight at us through his window, so hard that he actually turned his head to us while we were passing by. And there was still no girlfriend. I caught that incident on video, actually. Fortunately, this was the last time we ever saw him, but it still scared the hell out of me. I actually thought we were going to be chopped up that night by that guy. Me and Sam now joke about how we were nearly murdered on that trip from time to time, and we're actually going camping at the same place this upcoming weekend. I really hope that guy isn't there. I mean, what are the odds of him being there again? The sound of those tires slowly driving up the road and his glare gives me the chills every time I think about it. Rocky Top by Utnox18. The first thing I ever remember happening to me of a supernatural type happened when I was about 3 or almost 4. We lived in a house my parents still occupy to this day, on a farm that has been in the family for over 100 years. I'm 18 now, so this was quite a while ago, but I vaguely remember waking up in the early morning hours in my crib. I shared a room with my sister, who was about 10 at the time, and she was sleeping peacefully across the room. I got up and climbed out of my crib for no real reason, and I remember hearing a voice behind me saying, "Give me back my house." It was an old lady's voice, and as I turned around, I saw what 3-year-old me described as the diamond-faced woman. She was just a floating head that was diamond-shaped, but I do remember she also glowed blue. I screamed and ran back to my crib and covered my face with my covers, still screaming. My sister, being a sister, rolled over and told me to shut up while my mom came running in. I slept in my parents' bed that night. I didn't experience anything else really memorable aside from footsteps and shadows in that house. My brothers shared a room and would complain about seeing people in their room at night. One in particular was a man with a knife stuck in his head. Fast forward to when we moved into another house owned by the family. This house was lived in by my great-grandmother and then my grandfather. He passed in February, and the house really needed cleaning up, and we didn't officially move in until December of that same year. While we were cleaning and painting, all of us, Dad, my mom, and one of my brothers, experienced different things. One day, while Dad was up working and painting in the hallway, he was also doing laundry and left the basket in the laundry room that was located at the back of the house. He went into the back bedroom to get something, but when he opened the door into the hallway, suddenly the basket was now blocking the door. Just a small thing, really, but still creepy. I was up there alone one day and had just gotten done riding my horse that was up there for pasture. I would always walk in, turn on the radio perched on top of the piano in the living room, and go to the sink in the kitchen to get a drink. It was set up so that one of the doorways to the kitchen was right beside the living room. As I turned to go to the kitchen, the radio snapped off. This radio is one that fades once it's turned on. It doesn't just come on immediately. I turned thinking something had been unplugged or something like that, and as I got right up to it, the radio snapped back on louder than it was before. I instantly turned it off and went outside to wait for my dad to come pick me up. Once we did move in, I could never get settled. I didn't sleep very well at all, and my brother was constantly getting pinched or bothered in his room at night. One day, I was all alone in my room listening to music, and all of a sudden I had this pain in my knee. Not unbearable, just a pain, and I couldn't find the source. We had a dog, and she had started growling and looking above me. It was then that I remembered my grandfather would always squeeze my knee to pick on me. I just said, "Please stop it, Pa," and the pain lifted, and the dog stopped growling. The most recent occurrence I've experienced after we had moved back into our original house. A family wanted to rent out the other one. I was going to bed one night, and nothing was out of the ordinary. My sister and 2 brothers had moved out, so I had my own room. My mom's job made her get up at 3:30 every morning, which is necessary for this story. I was having a terrible dream, and all I remember from it was that it involved my horse and him being injured without me being able to stop it. I woke up with a start, and right in front of my face were two green eyes. I mean, clear, but just eyes. I closed my eyes tight and started trying to scream, and I could feel the fabric in my mouth moving, but no sound would come out. Something was holding me down by the neck, and it felt like a numb sensation where it was holding me. I remember being scared for my life and feeling dread like it was about to do something terrible to me, even worse than this. And then I heard the bathroom door, right beside my room, creak open, where Mom had gotten up, and it lifted and went away. I sat up and just stayed for a second, scared to move at all. Eventually, I got up and went to sit on the couch, and when Mom came into the room, she gasped and asked what had happened to me because I was so pale and gaunt-looking. I broke down in tears, telling her that I tried to scream for her, but this thing wouldn't let me. My mom is experienced in crystals and cleansing rooms with salt, and the next day while I was at school, she cleansed my room and put protective crystals all around. It took a while before I would go in there alone, but I started taking our dog to bed with me, and while she growled at something once, she since started sleeping with me, and nothing ever dared try to touch me again. I do have more stories, but they're more just little things, and stuff I've learned to ignore. I'm Afraid It'll Follow Me by Chicken Permission 13. When I was about 7 or 8, I was left home alone for the first time. I was really excited for this because while I love my family, they can be very protective and overbearing sometimes. This was the first time where I was really given some personal freedom at home. But it was also when strange things started to happen around me in my house. Or at least it's the earliest memory I have of something happening. I was in my room just sketching and coloring while listening to the TV in the background, when I realized that a show I don't like had come on. I also realized that I had left the remote next to the TV. As I got up to go get it, the second I was off the bed, a toy that had been on the top of my bookshelf on the other side of the room flew at the spot I was just sitting on. I want to let it be known that there was nothing that could have bumped the shelf, especially not to send it flying like that. There was no AC or windows open, and my door was shut, so none of my dogs could have snuck in and done something to move it. After that, I started to notice strange bruises and cuts on my body. I wasn't super active, but I was enough to just pass these off as nothing at first. But when I got foot surgery and couldn't really do anything for a while, I noticed new and even worse injuries started to show up. I left my door open at night, and my dogs would sleep with me, so that's what I thought it was at first, like most people would. So after that, I started to shut my door at night, at least until my injuries were gone, and told my family the reason and to leave it shut, which they all agreed to do. However, I still kept getting more and more injuries, but when I asked my family, they all said they had left my door shut and had no idea how I was still getting hurt, especially since I was known to be in an almost dead-like state, to put it in my friends' terms, when I slept. This still went on, but they got less intense and soon just became normal to me. I went for a few years without a big incident again, but throughout the time I noticed that I would sometimes get an intense feeling of being watched or see shadows moving out of the corner of my eye when no one else was around. Or I'd hear my name being called, but when asking my family, they all said they didn't call or hear anything. My dogs would sometimes growl at a particular spot in a room, and their eyes would move as if they were watching someone walk around. They would sometimes even go so far as to stand over my body while looking at something that I nor anybody else could see. I've also always had a hard time sleeping. My mom would often joke that I never slept for the first 5 years of my life, but on nights when it's especially hard, I can hear what is almost like someone breathing out in the hallway. It's a different kind of breathing than the overly obnoxious snores my parents produce next door. This breathing is even, but heavy, and still somehow loud enough to be heard over the snores. Over the years, however, it seems to be closer to the point where I will wake up hearing and feeling breath right in my ear, to which I just hold still and pretend to be asleep until I either fall back asleep or it goes away. Every so often, I'll feel like something is holding me down. I've never had sleep paralysis as far as I know. I sleep on my stomach a lot of the time. But sometimes I'll wake up and feel a pressure like hands on my shoulder blades or back. It's hard to describe, but it's a feeling in which I know it's not my family members or really anything human. And I don't think it's sleep paralysis because I know I can get out of it and move. But a gut feeling is telling me I'd really regret doing so. So, I'll let everybody know, I do believe in the supernatural. But even so, I always try to think of a more logical explanation when things happen to me or others. And that's how I tried to approach all of these situations. But the next time something happened, I couldn't reasonably think of one. My best friend had come to my house for a sleepover, and while I told her some of the weird things that have happened to me, I've never brought up the idea of the supernatural. As we were watching a horror movie centered on ghosts, I asked her if she thought something like this could be my situation. And while she actually agreed, saying she always got a weird feeling at my house, we both just continued to watch the movie, trying to lighten the mood. However, my friend took it too far, I suppose, because she started to laugh and taunt my ghost, as she put it. As she did, the device we were watching the movie on switched off, and the movie and games on the shelves next to us all flew off and at us. My friend never said another bad word about ghosts after that. But even to this day, electronics at my house still act up when that friend comes over, but are fine when she leaves or anyone else comes by. As the years went on, I only had incidents that happened a couple of years after each other. I still got unexplainable cuts and bruises, but like I said, I was used to it by now, and the only things that I just couldn't explain by any other logic were rather harmless stuff, like mulch from a plant flying at and almost hitting me, or a metal coffee can in the back of the table against the wall almost falling right on my foot when I walked by. I had recently got a ferret, and I would keep him in the room next door at night so my room wouldn't stink, and because he would often rattle and yank on the bars. However, not long after, I noticed he would be out of his cage when I walked into the room, and I've seen him escape the cage right in front of my eyes, and after that I put a pillow under the table he was on so if he got out up there he wouldn't hurt himself. But what confused me was one day I heard him let out a distressed cry. I thought he was hurt, so I ran into the room, only to see him perfectly fine, but on the bed in that room. That probably doesn't sound too bad, but he's only a baby and isn't long or strong enough to get up there on his own. And when I asked my family, all of them said they didn't put him up there, nor take him out of his cage. I believed them because 1, I immediately ran to the room. 2, I would have been able to hear the door open and close if someone did. And 3, why would he cry out like he was scared or in pain if this was just one of my family members, all of whom he was comfortable with? I mean, just picking him up and putting him on the bed. Another night, we had family visiting, and I gave up my room and slept in the room with my ferret. I woke up in the middle of the night and heard the sound of footsteps pacing in the room, and right after they stopped, I heard the noise of what sounded like when my ferret hops back in his cage. It might not sound weird, but just seconds prior to this, he was on the bed with me, and was on the other side of the room opposite of where his cage was, making it literally impossible for him to have made it there in that amount of time, especially for me not to hear him get off the bed beforehand. I do believe there's a supernatural being in my house, and even though none of my other family is attacked by it, I decided to ask my skeptic of a mom one day what she thought about ghosts and demons. She immediately replied, "I don't believe in any of that stuff." But when I noticed more weird events happening around the house, I asked my mom again, and she replied in the exact same way, but this time I asked what she thought of her house. She then hesitated and said, "Yeah, there's something here." I was shocked, and when I asked her why, she said that for almost all of my life she had seen weird stuff happen around the house. I'm 17 now, and nothing has happened or attacked me in the years, other than the normal cuts and bruises I've been accustomed to. I'm hopeful that it's over, or at least will be over when I go to college next year. But another part of me is waiting. Waiting for something big to happen and actually try to majorly hurt me. Or worse, that this thing is attached to me instead of the house, and that I'll never be rid of the burden that never seems to completely leave me. The Cabin Visit by Wishnot. I've always wondered what to make of this day I went to a cabin in the early 90s. After reading some of the other accounts and finding out other things that happened to people, I thought I would throw mine out there in the mix to see what everybody else thought. This would have to be my first unexplained event that ever happened to me. It wasn't ghostly in nature, but I suppose it could be considered paranormal. I've written about some things I and others have experienced at this cabin, but these events occurred in 2006 to 2014. So let me get started with this one from the early 90s. We have a cabin in the Ozark National Forest that sets in the middle of 80 acres. I've been enjoying it since around 1988, and over the years I would be there by myself to just do some deer hunting with my bow or rifle. On this occasion, I was by myself. I pretty much keep to a routine on days like that. Up way before sunbreak, coffee, descenting shower, dress, and head down to the lower part of the 80 and wait until daylight. That was my routine. I would set for a few hours and then ease back up to the cabin for a quick bite of breakfast before heading to the upper part of the 80 acres. At that time of my life, I was in construction and worked 4 10-hour days, leaving me with a 3-day weekend. Often, this would leave me by myself until later Friday evening, when some hunting buddies would show up. Anyway, this Friday morning I had already been on the lower part of the 80 and made it back to the cabin. I added wood to the wood-burning stove and had some breakfast. It was pushing 10 a.m. as I started easing up the incline of the road that led to the front portion. I made it about 20 yards when a deer jumped out ahead of me, about 50 yards up the road. It didn't go very far, just a bit off the road, and at the time the leaves on the ground were like potato chips and I could hear if it had kept going. I froze in my position as I thought about my next move. I stopped just to the side of a small cedar tree. There was very little wind, and it was in my favor as I stood motionless. I could just maybe make out the tail end of the deer, and I was waiting to see what it was going to do. And that's when I started hearing a very odd sound. It sounded like a mini helicopter coming in my direction. It continued until it would have been straight above me, maybe 25 feet up. Now, I had a completely clear view straight to the sound that was this loud, but nothing was there. It was not causing any disturbance from the wind that might have been obvious. The cedar wasn't moving, nor any leaves that were around me. But this thing was up above me for about 2 minutes, and then suddenly flew up the road and veered off to the left, off to where the deer had stopped. The deer went crazy and blew as it bounced away at a high rate of speed. I was left standing there wondering what in the world had just happened. I couldn't make any sense of it. I obviously heard something directly above me, but nothing was there. The deer heard it as well and reacted the way that it did. I wasn't so sure what to do, so I continued with my plan to hunt the upper end of the acreage. 20 minutes later, I was sitting at the base of a large oak, patiently waiting for deer to come my way. As I sat there, I replayed in my head what had happened earlier before. I had been there for an hour and a half or so, when again I heard that sound. It flew my way, and it came right above me. And again, I could not see anything. After about 2 or 3 minutes, I finally stood up and stretched my arms out, expressing, "What the hell?" And as I did it, whatever that was sped off again, not to return. I don't have a clue. I would describe it as a single prop something. It didn't have the sound the new drones make. Maybe it was a military drone? I don't know. It would have had to have been some type of cloaking device on it because I couldn't see a thing. And by the sound I surmised it would have been the size of the drones we do see now. The cabin is not anywhere close to a military facility. So what was that kind of tech available in the early 90s to the general public? I have so many unanswered questions. Sleep at the Farm, submitted by Louise C. I'm 64, but when this happened, I was 10 years old. To let you know why I was at this farm, my mom and dad were getting a divorce. We lived in another province than my dad, so they had to meet in Edmonton, Alberta, and my mom had to drive there as we lived in Saskatchewan. So my mom had me stay with a friend of hers. I was told at the time Molly and her husband had no children. When I got older, my mom then told me the truth. Molly and her husband had a son, but he was killed on a rig where he worked. There were no pictures of him in their house. Maybe it was just too painful for them to see. Anyway, we got to their farm in the afternoon. It was cloudy and overcast, so after my mom left, Molly's husband and I played cards till supper time. Now it was getting windy and raining out, and just after supper, the power went out. Molly gave me a lit candle, and I went to the bedroom I was to sleep in and started to read a book. Around 11 p.m., Molly came in to tell me that it was time to go to sleep, and she tucked me in. I kind of laughed it off, as I had not been tucked in for quite some time. Molly just said she needed me to feel safe. I wasn't sure what she meant, but didn't ask what she meant. It was still windy and raining, and I always slept good when it rained, so I went to sleep really quick. Around 3 a.m., their grandfather clock woke me up, and I could tell the weather outside was a lot worse, and it was pouring rain. As I was trying to fall back to sleep, I heard a truck driving around and around outside, so it pulled right up to the back door. I lay there waiting for whoever it was to knock on the door, but the knock never came. Then I heard the back door open and slam shut. I was scared and rolled over, faced the wall and pretended I was asleep. I heard loud, heavy boots walking across the kitchen floor and heading to the front room. Molly had a piano in the front room, and whoever it was started to bang on the piano keys. I lay there thinking, why is Molly's husband not up and chasing this person out? But being a kid, thought maybe they were doing the same thing I was, hoping whoever it was would just leave. Also, not far from the farm, there was a working rig at the time. At this time, I heard my bedroom door open, and don't ask me why, but I knew whoever it was standing in the doorway and breathing very, very heavy and very loud. Then I heard those heavy, loud boots coming over to the side of the bed, and a very strong feeling came over me that it wanted me to roll over, but I never moved. After a bit, I can't say how long, I heard the boots leave my room and go out the back door, slamming it. I just laid there very still till slowly I fell back asleep. In the morning, at the breakfast table, I asked Molly and her husband what they had heard and who they thought it was. They both looked at one another and said that they didn't hear anything. As I got older, I thought about that look they gave each other, and it was a strange look. I never wanted to go there again, and never did. So now you know what happened. I'll leave it up to you to decide. And by the way, no, it was not a dream of a 10-year-old. I was very much awake. My Crazy 4th of July Story, submitted by Cody. Here's a story for you that's timely. It happened on July 3rd in 1991. Full disclosure, I'm the reason that this all happened. I take full responsibility. I was a kid and did something dumb, but what happened afterwards was pretty messed up. I own the fact that I was responsible, but anyway, I'll stop babbling and get into my story. I was in high school working at a McDonald's. It was July 3rd, and none of us wanted to be working there at all. We wanted to be out with our other friends having a good time, watching fireworks and all that sort of thing. To add insult to injury, I was closing and also scheduled for the midday shift on July 4th the next day. So basically no holiday for me whatsoever. While talking to my coworkers and contemplating quitting, I knew that I couldn't because I had to save up money for college that was coming up in the next year or so. Before I go any further, I should let everyone know that I'm a male, and at that time, I was in good shape. I'm not huge or intimidating, but 6 foot, maybe 190 pounds at the time. Wiry, and I was really into boxing back then. So I was working the drive-thru, and a car pulled in around 9:45. Back then, our store closed at around 11 o'clock, so at that point in the evening, we were kind of taking things a little lax, but still doing our jobs. Again, we were all kind of pissed we were there, so I'm sure our heart wasn't in it. This guy was acting kind of funny when I started to take his order. He was mumbling what he wanted, and it was hard for me to hear him, and I remember having to ask him more than once how we could help him and what he wanted. He kept asking for a shamrock shake, which, obviously, in the middle of July, we weren't serving. When I kept telling him that we didn't have that, but we could make him something else, he was getting more and more irate. Finally, he just screamed into the intercom that he wanted a Big Mac, a large fry with whatever effing shake you want to make me. That's what he said. I said okay, gave him the total, and told him to pull around. When my coworkers asked what kind of shake he wanted, I just said vanilla. The dude pulled up to the window, and I leaned out to get his payment. I could tell right away that something was very wrong. He was sweating bullets and fidgeting like all hell. And I again told him the total, reached out my hand to take his money, and instead of giving me the money, he grabbed my hand and tried to pull me through the window. I yelled and told him, "Don't you effing touch me, asshole," and I yanked my hand back. I asked him if he wanted his food, and if he did, he'd better be cool, or I'd call the police if he wanted to play that game. He looked at me deadpan for a minute, apologized, and said he thought I was trying to rip the money out of his hand. Yeah, right. He handed me the money, I gave him his change, and turned to get his order, shaking my head at my coworkers with the universal, holy crap look. I got his order, reached out again through the window with the bag to hand him his stuff, and he took it. Without saying anything, he drove off, and I thought, well, that's that. Nope. Within less than 5 minutes, he was back in the drive-thru and placing another order. I recognized his voice right away. I again took his order, which was the exact same thing he ordered the first time around, and just told him to pull around. He pulled up to the drive-thru window, and as I was opening the window, he whipped his vanilla shake at me, and it caught part of the window, but it splashed all over me. Then he proceeded to tell me he was going to gut me like a fish, and that I'd better be careful on my way home. Okay, at this point, my manager, who happened to be walking up to the front counter, heard what he said, pushed me out of the way, and tried to take over the situation. She told him that he was no longer welcome at our McDonald's, and that if he didn't leave immediately, she was going to call the police. He threw his sandwich at her, screamed at me again, said that I was a dead motherfucker, then peeled out and was going so fast he couldn't cut the corner of the drive-thru. He jumped the curb, drove across our grass, almost sideswiped the giant McDonald's signpost, and by the time he was done, jumped the curb back into the street and took off down the road. My manager went to call the police to report what just happened, and the rest of us were just kind of looking at one another going, what the fuck was that all about? I mean, we were all taken aback. It was insane. I was already in a bad mood for having to work 2 shifts on a holiday, and I didn't need this extra drama. The police came out, talked to my manager and me, and assessed the damage to the grass. My manager then called the store owner to let him know what happened, and that's when the other extension on our phone system rang. We had a phone in the back office, but we also had a phone up at the front near the drive-thru where I happened to be working. I knew my manager was on the main line, so I just picked up the other line and said, "Thank you for calling McDonald's. How can I help you?" There was a pause, and then a voice that I had to recognize right away as the guy who had just gone through the drive-thru saying, "Hey, Cody, I'm gonna gut you like a fish." I didn't know what to say. Of course, I had my name tag on, so that's how he knew my name, but the fact that he called to say it again really set me off. My coworker Brian knew something was up, and came over to see me, and saw that my mouth was open, aghast at what I had just been told. being a cocky teenager, and this is where I take responsibility for everything, I said, "Is that what you're going to do, asshole? Why don't you come back here, asshole? We'll fuck you up real good." Yeah, I know. Not smart. Again, I said what happened that night was my fault. He started screaming through the phone at me all this crazy stuff about how he was going to kill me and my family. He was going to wait in the parking lot until I got out of work, follow me home, and then, quote, fuck me up. At this point, I was so pissed about everything, I just kept him going and saying all kinds of crazy stuff and threatening him back. My manager came up behind me, tapped me on the shoulder, shook her head, waved her finger, literally waved her finger, and then hung up the phone for me. She said that she understood I was upset, but I couldn't ever talk to anyone on the phone like that again. Okay, so now we're getting down to closing, and everyone is getting things shut down. I'm wiping down the front counters and taking care of things up there before I close out my register. I hear the drive-thru beep, but no one answers me when I ask, "May I help you?" Before I can even do anything, guess who pulls up at the window? The same guy. Only now, he's holding up a knife and waving it at me. Before I can say anything or call for my manager, he takes off again, this time managing to maneuver through the drive-thru driveway and get back onto the road without jumping the curb. Good for him. I immediately told my manager, who immediately called the police again, who also again came out to talk to us. Now I'm freaking out more than ever. He's already threatened to follow me home, and I don't know what to do. As soon as the police left, the phone rings again. My manager answered it while standing right in front of me, and I could only hear the screaming from, again, you guessed it, this guy. My manager again tried to handle it professionally, told the man he was in deep trouble and the police were going to be looking for him. She hung up, and that was that. Unfortunately, I had ridden my bike to work that night and not borrowed my dad's car. So, being freaked out but also trying to keep my composure and my pride intact, I simply finished up my job, got on my bike, and started to make my way home. It wasn't really that far, maybe 2 or 3 miles. As I was riding down the street, I heard a vehicle behind me, so I glanced over my shoulder, and it was a car with its brights on. It was maybe 20 feet behind me at that point, and I didn't think anything of it. I mean, there were lots of cars out. But that was when I heard the engine rev, and I knew that that car was launching at me. I did another double take and saw that the car was almost on top of me, so I jumped off of my bike onto the grass, and the bike kind of did a Ghost Rider in front of me. The car blew past me and down the street, and now I'm really freaking out at this point because I recognized the car as belonging to the guy from the drive-thru. He went around a corner, and I couldn't see him anymore, so I ran and got back on my bike and started pedaling like mad. I didn't want to go back to my McDonald's because I was kind of halfway home at that point, so I started cutting down side streets to try to throw the scent off this guy. Maybe he wouldn't be able to find me. That didn't work. Less than 5 minutes later, I heard him rocketing down the road behind me again. Keep in mind, these are all suburb residential streets, so lots of stop signs. And what I think was going to be people out shooting off fireworks or just enjoying the night before the 4th of July, well, no one was out. The car came right up behind me again and slowed down just enough to be right behind me. The guy starts laying on the horn, and I jump up onto the sidewalk, and he floors it again and goes up the street. At this point, I actually got off my bike and stood there, started walking it, thinking there's no way I'm going to get back in the road if this guy is going to keep doing this. Another block away, I knew there was a payphone outside of a pizza place, so I got on my bike and pedaled as fast as I could, and I got to the phone booth. It wasn't really a phone booth, just a payphone on a pole. I didn't have any change, so I just hit 0 for the operator and started yelling into the phone that I was in trouble and there was some guy trying to kill me. The operator got me to the police, and again I started yelling about this guy chasing me in his car. As I was talking to the dispatcher, I looked to my side, and I see the car barreling down on me again. I'm still on the phone, and this guy hits the brakes, pops the wheels over the curb right at me, and it comes to a stop. The dispatcher can hear what's going on as I drop the phone and start running away. The guy got out of his car, started chasing me through the parking lot of this pizza place, and thankfully it was still open. 2 guys came out and wondering what the hell was going on, and got in this guy's face. This paused him long enough for the police to show up and tackle him. He was swinging at the fences, and the 2 police officers who were detaining him had all they could do to wrangle him to the ground. The 2 guys from the pizza place tried to help, but the police told him to stop and stay away. Crazy guy in the car was still holding this knife, flailing it around, and cutting himself, which he did more than once. His arms, his thighs, man, I was terrified. I'm not ashamed to admit that as a guy who thought he was being a tough guy earlier in the night, couldn't believe what was happening to me. So the cops finally got him in handcuffs, and an ambulance showed up, and they immediately took him away. I stood there talking to the police as they called my parents to come down and get me and talk to them as well. My manager even showed up after my parents called her, and there was a huge conference in this poor pizza place's parking lot, which I'm sure was not good for their business. I ended up pressing charges against this guy, who happened to be a drug addict and also a felon. They also found a handgun in his car, which was illegal for him to have in the state that I live in. He went to prison for multiple violations, including trying to hurt me. It's been many years since this happened, but it was a terrifying night for me, and every year around the 4th of July, I remember that guy trying to run me down, and I wonder if he had been any faster or smarter, would he actually have pulled it off? Anyway, I ended up quitting my job at McDonald's and ended up getting a job at the pizza place, as funny as that sounds. I do know this guy's name, and every once in a while I will do GIS to see any information about him. I know he got out of jail a long time ago, and I don't know if he still lives in the same town that I used to, but thankfully I don't live in that town anymore. I'm still wary of that guy. I'm sure he's way into his 50s or 60s. I mean, who knows? I can't imagine that he even remembers me, but he might, and all I can say is I'm no longer a scared kid. The threats I made to him over the phone trying to be a tough guy way back when would actually be put into practice right now, especially with my wife and kids. So, to the crazy guy at the drive-thru who tried to kill me on a 4th of July so many moons ago, make sure we never meet. Abduction or Astral Projection. Submitted by Ashley K. This is not my story, but I swear it's 100% true. My name is Ariana, I'm 18, and I've lived in Michigan my whole life. The road I currently live on is called Morrow Road, which has been known for many, many years as a paranormal hotspot, most famously for a ghost story, but that's not what this story is about. My family has always gone out on our boat touring islands, so I tend to be home alone for the majority of the summer. I never truly feel alone, though I do not sleep at night. My friends and I, and even my dad, have suspected extraterrestrial activity in this area since we first moved there. This was the summer of 2017, and my dad, my friend, and I were going on one of our famous night walks. It was about 1 a.m., and we had made it about a mile down my road. I was the first one to see it. A bright light in the sky, much, much bigger than a star. I immediately pointed it out to the others, and as soon as they looked up, the light zigzagged across the sky and fluctuated from very slow movements to very fast for a few seconds. Then the light completely vanished. That was the first experience we had. About a year later, in the summer of 2018, my family was absent again for the night, and I was given permission to have a few friends over, because they knew how scared I was of being alone. We were all sitting in the bed of my friend Jacob's truck, just goofing around like any other night. I live out in a secluded area with few houses and tons of farmland, so being parked in my driveway, we could easily see the skies for miles around us. During this time, I noticed another huge light in the sky. This time it was very different, though. It was about a mile or two away, and it seemed to come out of nowhere. It took about a second for the light to drop from where I initially saw it down to the very top of the tree line. The light hovered there for a few seconds before slowly dropping down below the trees. The location it would have dropped down at would have been the setting for the next incident I experienced. My friends did not see this, but they began to freak out once they realized how petrified I was. I said goodbye to them and quickly went inside. A few months later, when the air began to cool down for autumn, I had my most recent and frightening experience. As I said before, I don't sleep at night, so I went to bed at 10 a.m. with the intentions of having my friend Chloe call me when she was ready to hang out. She was getting out of work at 4. I woke up at 3 in a panic and began checking under my bed, in the closet, and all around my room to make sure that I was still alone. After my search was unsuccessful, I went back to sleep because I knew I still had an hour before Chloe would get out of work and call me. This is where it gets weird. I began to dream that I was walking down my road, a very vivid purple and pink sunset filling the sky, as well as huge clouds. I pulled out my phone to take a video of the sky to post on my Snapchat, and right after I put my phone back in my pocket, I noticed a very large, completely perfect circle in the sky in front of me. The circle was completely see-through, except on the other side of it, the sky looked very blue instead of purple and pink like the rest of the sky. I looked over and saw a UFO landing maybe 500 feet away from me, before I blacked out. I woke up in my dream, and I was in an empty lab laying on an exam table. I could tell that something happened to me, but I couldn't exactly tell what. Again, I blacked out instantly. The next time I woke up, I was walking past an old abandoned ranch, and I continued walking down the road. But at the corner, I read the street sign that said Starville and Broadbridge. After that, I actually did wake up. I was laying in my bed, confused because the dream had felt so real. I picked up my phone and noticed that I had a ton of texts, calls, and Snapchats from my friend Chloe, so I called her immediately. She asked me why I was on the corner of Starville and Broadbridge. I began to freak out and told her about my dream, and we both started to cry. She knew my location because she had checked the map on Snapchat. It had said that I was there 4 minutes ago, and every minute that she refreshed it, I got closer to home, all the way down to 1 minute ago. And then I called her right after that, and it said I was back home. She said it was even to the point where she almost screenshotted it because it was so odd, but she thought I was just being an ass and not returning her calls. My mom can even attest that I was home, since she checked on me a few times to see if I was still sleeping. I did not know that Broadbridge was long enough to intersect with Starville Road, until she told me that it said I was on there on SnapMap. We told her uncle, who was very into these type of things, and he drove us out there. To our dismay, there was an abandoned ranch out there that looked exactly the same as the one in my dream. Her uncle told us that he had done dumpster work there years ago when it had first been abandoned. The people who lived there had installed a ton of new and modern things, such as tennis courts and new barns for the property. But then they suddenly just left. All of their belongings were left behind, and the house was sold for an incredibly cheap price. The man who owns it now lives in Florida and only pays the electric bill. When we looked it up on Google Earth Images, there were long runway-like strips behind the trees in the property that we suspect are being used for UFOs. I'm not sure if I was abducted that day, or if I possibly astral projected to that spot. My mom has a friend who was into the Wiccan culture who has suspected that I astral project all the time. This is because I have very vivid, random, scary dreams. She believes that there's an evil spirit in my house that is reflecting whatever fear and pain is going through or has gone through me, which I interpret in my dreams. She says I must possess a gift, since my phone was able to pick up where I was, and that I may be dreaming at the same time I'm astral projecting, since I don't realize that I'm doing it. She hopes that one day we can sit down and she can teach me how to properly control this gift. I'm not sure exactly what happened that day, but I have a lot of paranormal experiences with aliens, ghosts, skinwalkers, and more. I feel like these things are drawn to me because I can pick up on them. I hope that one day I will be able to understand it. Alabama Highway 36 by MK1. This story took place in the summer of 1996 on rural Highway 36 near Lacey Spring, Alabama. It's a small community located between Huntsville and Hartselle. I was living in Birmingham, Alabama at the time, and my girlfriend, now my wife, was with me for this experience. I'm a professional musician, and I'd come up to Huntsville, Alabama for a gig I had at a local music hall just outside the downtown area of the city. After my show, I packed up to leave, got paid, and we were on our way back to Birmingham. It was approximately 2 a.m. as we were leaving Huntsville, and some inclement weather was beginning to form outside of the west of the city, so my girlfriend and I opted for a shortcut route towards our destination to possibly avoid the approaching storm. We stopped once at a gas station on the main thoroughfare, Highway 231, also known as Memorial Parkway. We got a bottle of water and some snacks for the hour-and-a-half drive back to Birmingham. While in the store, the friendly clerk offered some information that a tornado had been reported due west of Huntsville, and that we'd do well to keep the radio tuned to a local weather station if we were continuing on the road. The entire North Alabama area is considered a year-round tornado alley, so while we are always cognizant of weather, we simply monitor conditions and go about our lives. We continued out of Huntsville on Highway 231, crossed the Tennessee River, and entered the tiny community of Lacey Springs, Alabama. The skies looked ominous as we took a right turn onto Highway 36, which would eventually cross Interstate 65, leading us back to Birmingham. As I mentioned, Alabama Highway 36 is a rural two-lane state road that passes through several extremely tiny communities. There's only one traffic light on the entire 36-mile stretch, and save for a handful of houses and small businesses located along the road, at nighttime the area is nearly pitch black, desolate, and seemingly deserted. Even during daylight hours, traffic on Highway 36 is usually light. Maybe once in a while you'd occasionally see a sheriff's patrol car, a dump truck, or a small trailer with bales of hay. On this particular night, however, my girlfriend and I got the scare of our lives as we turned west onto Highway 36. Small hail had begun to fall, and the winds were picking up. Thus far, the road was absolutely deserted, and there were no lights anywhere. The radio reported a possible tornado was just west of the city of Huntsville, which was now about 25 minutes north of our location. What we saw on our drive in the next 30 minutes will haunt us for the rest of our days. We'd driven west about 3 or 5 miles when the hail turned to light rain, and as we came around a bend in the road, we saw headlights, but something didn't look right. The headlights we saw were not in horizontal array, but vertical, and they had obviously been set on bright, which you might use in inclement weather. The vehicle was facing east. We approached the headlights carefully, and as I slowed the car to a crawl and lowered my window, my girlfriend and I saw that the headlights were from a brand new red SUV, which was lying on its passenger side on the edge of the road, the interior lights on, the engine running, and the driver's side door was inexplicably open. I stopped our car completely and repeatedly yelled out, "Hey, anybody in there? Is anybody hurt? Can you hear me? Do you need help? Anybody need help?" I got no response. The inexplicable thing was that the red SUV looked brand new, and there were no marks or any evidence that the car had been in any sort of accident or had been picked up by the high winds of a tornado. As I mentioned, North Alabama is threatened by tornadoes year-round, and I've seen literally hundreds of vehicles that have flipped, rolled, or been destroyed by the deadly force of a tornado. Vehicles anywhere close to a tornado are always covered in silt and debris, and usually the windows are blown out. The red SUV we saw was absolutely pristine. It looked as if it had been simply lifted by a giant hand and then sent gently on its side. My girlfriend and I decided to continue on, hoping to flag down a sheriff's deputy if we happened to pass one. We didn't own cell phones yet. Just a couple of more miles down Highway 36, we spotted the lights of yet another vehicle stopped near the road. As we got closer, we saw that this vehicle was a green SUV, upside down in the shallow roadside ditch, engine running, all the lights on, driver's side door open, and no one anywhere around the vehicle. Creeped out and concerned, I lowered my girlfriend's passenger side window and again yelled for anyone who might need help. And once again, no response whatsoever. There was no evidence that a tornado had passed through this area, as there were no limbs down, no sign of debris, no trees bent or snapped. It was just a little rainy. But what happened next is the scariest thing I've ever seen. We continued on. It was nearly 3 a.m. We rounded another wooded bend that opened into a clearing on both sides of the road, and already a little freaked out, I noticed the road seemed to be moving. I slowed down. As we got closer, my girlfriend and I saw that the road, the shoulder, the ditches, everything was covered in small frogs, hopping in all different directions. I don't mean there were a couple of hundred frogs in the road. There were thousands upon thousands of frogs. They covered almost every inch of the road and shoulder as far as we could see. Now, we were getting kind of scared. Totally freaked out. Whatever we'd driven into, my girlfriend and I decided that we should get the hell out of there right then. The insane thing is that we kept driving, running over the frogs, sadly, but there seemed to be no end of them. We figured we drove at least 3 more miles before we couldn't see any more frogs. They were everywhere. Everything was inundated with these little small hopping living frogs. We saw no further cars in the road, and we had to make our turnoff towards Birmingham. By the time we reached the junction of Alabama Highway 36 and Interstate 65, we stopped at an all-night gas station to hop out and just were shaking our heads. We simply couldn't believe what we'd seen. 2 different SUVs, one on its side, one flipped on its roof, but with no visible damage. The engines running, the lights on, with the owners nowhere to be found, and what looked like a veritable biblical plague of small frogs covering every square inch of the highway. Now, a few details. Neither I nor my girlfriend had been drinking or had ingested any mind-altering narcotics of any sort. Neither of us are prone to hallucinations, and we are both super alert, highly educated Christian people with no history of psychotic behavior. The next morning, we found that no tornado or high winds had been spotted, reported, or recorded anywhere in the immediate vicinity of our sighting, which ruled out that the wrecked SUVs and the frogs were a product of any weather-related event. Seeing that we're extremely weather-aware, I immediately began researching into this incident with the frogs. Our area does have a high concentration of professional people educated on weather, science, and psychology, so I consulted with some meteorologists, engineers, some scientists, heck, even a psychiatrist friend, and even some people who are known to be lightning rods for paranormal activity. The science guys all agreed that frogs do have a mating season where they will make an exodus from their environment to begin the mating process, but since there were no large enough freshwater bodies nearby, the sheer number of frogs we witnessed could not be explained by animal biology. The meteorologists all agreed that during certain weather events such as a tornado or waterspout, it is highly likely that marine-dwelling animals like frogs could be sucked out of their habitat by the vortex of the winds, but that they would likely be blown quite high into the air and would actually fall back to the ground encased in hail, and very few, if any, would survive a fall from even a height of 20 feet. Also, a waterspout or tornado would not simply pick up frogs. It would also pick up fish, birds, and water-dwelling vegetation. None of those were present. So, if the frogs that my girlfriend and I witnessed had been sucked up by a storm before being deposited into the road in front of us, it's highly unlikely that many of them would have still been alive. But they all were. Furthermore, the sheer number of frogs and the size of the area where we witnessed them ruled out any type of mating migration. We were left with no rational scientific or meteorological explanation. As for the wrecked but intact SUVs, we called the police and sheriffs, and they had no reports of vehicle accidents in that area for that date and time. 2 people with experience in paranormal activity whom I consulted were equally baffled. I have quite a few experiences which I consider to be paranormal happened in my life, but no other experiences like this. I mean, what could that have been? The wrecked cars are one thing, but a plague of hopping living frogs in every direction for at least 3 miles on a remote highway? I don't know. I have no explanation. This event happened 20 years ago, and it doesn't cause me any fear or anxiety. It was just very scary, unexplained by rational thought and professional sciences. Hotel Creeper, submitted by NB. Thanks for telling my Uber horror story in Volume 50. This next story is told from the perspective of a friend of mine I used to work with at a Holiday Inn. Let me start out with my name. It's Sarah, and at the time I was 35 years old working the night audit for a hotel in northern Georgia. I've worked there for 3 years and loved my job, especially working nights. As a night audit, you see all kinds of crazy shit, and trust me, I've seen it all. However, this one night changed it all for me. A little backstory before I get to that. The front desk manager at the time was a middle-aged woman named Kathy. She is a devout Christian and has a soft spot for the homeless. We had this regular homeless man that came by named Patrick, and he was a tall, skinny black man, just to give you a description. At first, I also liked Patrick, and he would come in during my evening shifts, and we would talk, and I would let him hang out for a bit. After a while, though, he became very aggressive about his panhandling in the parking lot for second shift. Customers were constantly complaining, and we were receiving bad reviews because of it. So, on to the horrific night. I was at work like usual, and I received a complaint from a customer walking into the hotel, saying there was a panhandler in the parking lot. Of course, it was Patrick. I assured the customer that I would take care of it, and I went from behind my desk and made my way outside to the parking lot and was walking the area. Yeah, I know it's very stupid and dangerous for a female to be doing this, but I am trained in hand-to-hand combat and some weaponry. I was continuing my walk when all of a sudden I was snatched up from behind, and sure enough, it was Patrick. Instinct kicked in, and I flung my head back as hard as I could and connected with Patrick's nose. He released me and was cursing on the ground. I ran so fast that I came out of my slip-on shoes. I ran back in, locked the front doors, and dialed 911, shaking, and my head was racing so freaking bad I thought I would pass out. The police officer arrived, and I came outside and told him everything, and he saw how freaked out I was. He assured me, "Don't worry, this guy will resist." He was the coolest police officer I'd ever met. After the incident, I took some time off and was going to find another job. However, I still ended up working there for another year, and our manager finally hired a security guard for the overnight shift. People around town started telling me shortly after my encounter they saw Patrick around the local gas station, and he had a huge bandage on his nose. So, Patrick, first off, you can go to hell, and secondly, let's never meet again. One Good Monster Deserves Another, submitted by SMACG4. My first memories as a child were of being abused, and those images are burned into my memory for life. The abuse I suffered continued late into my childhood, and my pleas of help to my mother and father went unheeded, as they could not believe that a family member so close to them could do such unspeakable things to their child. The very mention of the topic brought on vicious arguments between my parents, until they finally divorced when I was 12. For a very long time, I felt I was the cause of their separation. I'm still not sure. When they separated, at least there was some peace in the house, but that was not to last. Soon my mother found out that her life was far more fun without my father, and she began drinking, taking drugs, and partying all night with a bunch of local bikers. But she had one small problem. Me. She started antagonizing me and calling me retarded repeatedly because I was crying for my father. Of course, as a child, I was very defensive of my father, and when I would say that I loved him, she would start to hit me until she would get a good punch or a kick in. I'd be on the floor crying. Finally, I snapped, and when I pushed my mother away while she was screaming at how I should have been drowned at birth, she got all calm and picked up the phone. Little did I know, things were about to get worse. My mother called her family and told them that I had hit her and that she could not cope with an abusive child. She told me to pack my things as I was going to stay with her family for 2 weeks to settle down. But I had my suspicions that she just wanted her bratty kid out of the way. So, I found myself on a plane, alone at 12 years old, headed to the very house where my abuser lived, and not for a 2-week stay, but for 2 freaking years. To my eternal horror and shame, I found that I had to sleep in my abuser's old bed and wear my abuser's old hand-me-down clothing. Then the grooming began again, with my abuser offering me special gifts, a bit of extra cash, and even drugs. I was on my own, and there was no one to protect me or believe me, so I fought off the playful wrestling and ignored the lewd comments until the threats started, and the attempts to playfully wrestle became painful escapes for my abuser. I was alone in a town where everyone loved my abuser, and I was going insane trying to cope. Enter the hero. My father came to town and took me away from all that madness. The problem was, he could not take away the madness that had grown inside me. I had 3 good years of peace and happiness with my father, going to bike shows, shooting guns, helping build cars, and doing kid stuff with him. Unfortunately, though, he could do nothing against my abuser. He told me that my mother's side of the family were members of some secret boys' club with fancy rings and secret handshakes, and that he could not speak against them for fear of his life. All the time, I just thought they were some type of gang, and I didn't really understand what he said. I really tried to start a new life with my dad, but troubled teens will be troubled teens, and my dad and I parted ways when I dropped out of school. I did my best, but I was traumatized before anyone knew what PTSD was, and it led me into making some really bad decisions that landed me in jail and a series of group homes, where I suffered further abuses. As an adult, I drifted in and out of relationships for years, always wondering why they blew up in my face so spectacularly, and why I had never had any good friendships with any of my ex-girlfriends afterwards. Women just seemed to hate me, I thought. One girlfriend had attacked me with a knife, another dumped me when I told her I loved her, and yet another ripped my heart to pieces when I asked her to marry me. After so many failures and frustrations, I just gave up on ever finding some measure of happiness with a woman and set about living the best I could alone. I bought a small house and devoted myself to trying to help people in hopes of finding a more platonic love and some measure of self-respect. I taught music and worked as a repairman for many years, and I really enjoyed being the guy who could fix anything. In some small way, I looked at myself as a small hero when I could walk into a hostile mess and walk out with everyone happy. But I still felt an emptiness in my heart. About 12 years ago, a precious bundle of joy arrived in my arms in the form of a 5-week-old pit bull puppy. The puppy was a gift from one of my oldest friends, Nigel, whose dog I had rescued a couple of years ago. My puppy looked like a little mouse with tiger stripes all over his body, and the crest of his chest formed a white T, and he had white spots on the bottoms of all 4 paws that you could see flash when he ran. This was my first dog ever, and I had planned in advance to have several months off work so I could train him properly. Not having a job forced me to find ways to supplement my income, as now I had an extra ravenous mouth to feed. After a short time, I found that I could make decent income working from home teaching music and doing odd jobs. And during that time, I found out just how smart this puppy was. While I thought I was training him, he was actually training me. I developed a certain anxiety about leaving him alone when I was returning to a regular job and what damage he could do to my house. So I decided to continue working from home, fully realizing that my puppy had trained me to stay. I was willing to forgive him for this, as he taught me how to love again, too. Thus began a series of adventures between a boy and his dog that I could write volumes about. Never during these happy years did I suspect that my childhood abuser still had me in his grip, and there was never going to be an easy way to escape. This is when I met Colette. Colette was a sweet girl who just happened to be the little sister of an old acquaintance of mine, Rick. She had that precocious little sister attitude, and I just knew she had terrorized her older brother to tears when they were younger. She had a voice that could make a drunken bagpiper cringe, and a way of talking so fast that everything became one word. I guess it was an effective way for her to get attention in a room full of people, away from her older brother. She also had this cute way of acting when she lost an argument or got caught in a fib. She would become calm, and for a while her voice would be normal instead of the usual chimpanzee screeches. I think her brother would torment her just so she would settle down and stop acting like a weasel on Red Bull just for a few minutes. Unfortunately, I think her competition with her brother was what made her look at every man in the room as a challenge to be conquered. On our first date, I caught her staring at me over a bowl of Vietnamese food, and I could see her calculating something in her head. Unfortunately, I didn't realize at the time she was a predator, and she was sizing me up as prey. Colette had developed some fearsome hunting assets that supplemented her average looks, and soon she learned that she could show those assets off and get the attention of all the men in the room without ever having to learn any hunting etiquette. Now I found myself hypnotized by those very same assets, and I thought, what the hey, I'm an older guy with time on my hands and an empty nest. Why not invite her into my house? Oh boy, what a horror show that turned out to be. Colette brought her boyfriend, Brian, to our second date, and I watched as she sat beside me on the couch and left him to sit in a chair across the room while she emasculated the poor guy by fawning all over me and rubbing my leg right in front of him. I should have realized on the spot that she was a predator with no conscience or sense of empathy, but I got suckered by the sad tale she told me about how she had been abused in her first love and the father of her child, Joey. So I watched poor Brian wither under her assault on his ego and masculinity until he departed from Colette's life. Then she took me to the bedroom and into her clutches. I settled down to 2 years of relative bliss with Colette as long as I fed her liquor and drugs while letting her have her homosexual friend come over to get drunk and scream at each other. Colette said she wanted to have a child with me, and since I had an empty nest to fill, I ignored her weird comments about cannibalism, her fetish for talking about sex with dogs, and the fact that she used nearly everything in the house to pleasure herself. But when she told me that her and her older brother had been abused by an older family member, I took an interest, as it was a topic I knew a lot about firsthand, unfortunately. I suggested that she read Freud's opinion on how adult sexuality is formed based on the earliest sexual experiences, and that her need to smash and destroy all men before her was the result of her first sexual experiences with her brother. I told her that any strong man that she met now represented her brother, and she needed to conquer them at all costs. As expected, that didn't go very well, and I was assaulted by constant accusations of wanting to sleep with my sister. Talk about striking an insecure nerve in Colette's psyche. Whoops. I think that one planted the seeds of doom for our pretend relationship. She had realized that I was too smart for her, and she could never conquer me or win at any of the silly little games she played to test me. I told her that the men in her life had probably abused her because she would allow them to take any initiative in the relationship, because all she wanted them to do was shut up, get drunk, and shmoo-shmoo. Well, that was it, and we were done. So I went back to what I loved before I met Colette, teaching music and having fun with my tiger-striped pit bull. I tutored a good friend and helped her earn her paramedic ticket. I taught another friend to play the bagpipes, and I taught my dog some new tricks. Too bad I didn't learn anything because I was about to meet a monster. About 2 years ago, my old friend Nigel brought his 23-year-old son to meet me. Immediately, my first impression was that the kid gave me this creepy Buffalo Bill vibe with his spidery body and sickly complexion. I had heard about how his father had tried to rescue his son from his mother's side of the family for years, and the story touched my heart as I could relate to my own childhood experiences. Nigel told me his son, who I will call Mud, had been pulled out of the northern native community because he had run afoul of just about everyone over meth, cocaine, MDMA, and just about anything he could smoke, inject, or swallow. Nigel asked me to let the kid stay with me and help him clean up before he got AIDS or got murdered for being, well, himself. So I thought to myself, I could fix just about anything. What I should have remembered is that you just can't fix stupid. But Nigel said he was a good worker and that he could work off the $4,000 in debt Nigel had owed me for years. So I took the kid in and did my best to help him. So the couple of years went by, and the kid did a good job of convincing me that he was clean, though I had my suspicions that he wasn't. Mud had this little buddy he met at work named Kyle, who would come over and get blackout drunk and sleep over in Mud's room, and I started to wonder if Kyle was supplying Mud with cocaine. The problem was that when they were having a sleepover, I knew the only place to sleep in his room was a tiny single bed, and I did not want to bust them doing something other than cocaine. One night, I got a really creepy vibe from them as Mud and Kyle were having a few too many drinks, and Mud started to jones hard for cocaine. His buddy Kyle kept refusing to get any more, and Mud got really dark and started demanding it from Kyle. Now I knew Mud had been lying about being clean, but he was too drunk and violent at the time for me to effectively confront him about it. I tried to calm Mud down and get him to go to bed, but it was no use. He kept demanding cocaine. Kyle poured him almost an entire bottle of rum in a glass and kept yelling at him until Mud drank the whole thing. I thought this would knock the kid out, and it seemed to work as the two went downstairs for their sleepover. Not 20 minutes later, while I was outside of my house for a smoke in the cool of the night, Kyle came running out of the house, half-dressed, looking wild-eyed and terrified. I stood on the sidewalk with him in front of my house and asked him what was going on. At that moment, Mud exploded out of the front door of my house, dressed only in sweatpants. Kyle cringed behind me and said, "He's trying to stab me." I didn't see Mud with any kind of knife, so I smirked and thought it was a homosexual thing. But the fear in Kyle was real, and I could smell it pouring out of his sweaty body. When Mud saw Kyle hiding behind me, he gave me a look that sent a chill up my spine that I will remember to the grave. Mud's eyes seemed to be completely black, and his body looked like rage and hate clothed in sallow, sickly skin. Mud lunged forward, muttering insanely while staring hatefully at us, then suddenly veered off and stormed off down the street, screaming obscenities at the top of his lungs. I stayed with Kyle until some of his friends came and drove him off, and that was the last time I saw the poor guy. I didn't think too much more on it as I was really tired and a little bit tipsy myself. Mud wandered in some hours later while I was sleeping and dreaming about not having to apologize to the neighbors every 2 weeks when this idiot got drunk and terrorized the neighborhood. For fuck's sake, I was thinking Mud was going to pound on their doors demanding they buy him crack the next time he got drunk. There were some intervals of tranquility, though. Every so often, Mud would go to see his ex-girlfriend, ex-dealer Tina, to visit with her and his infant child for the weekend. Tina and Mud had had a bad relationship in the past, and she'd been scared to death by Mud when they lived together up north, so she had fled to another province to hide from him. Mud found her and threatened to have her child taken away if she did not return and allow him visits. She complied, and this seemed to mollify Mud for a bit, and he began to visit, and eventually they started dating again. It was a hot and sunny day in early August when Mud was getting ready for one of his visits to Tina, when I noticed that my dog was starting to get sick. He lost control of his bladder and peed all over the front porch. Mud scolded him, but I was really concerned for his health as his urine was greenish, full of pus, and extremely vile-smelling. Mud left for his visit, and I got busy with trying to find out what I could do to help my pup, as I suspected that he had a bladder or kidney infection. Over the next few days, my dog's condition worsened, to the point where he couldn't walk, and I had to carry him out to the front yard to pee and take a crap. I was too concerned with my dog to notice that Mud had taken all of his belongings with him, and he had skipped out on me owing several months' rent. Anyway, I looked on the internet for any way to help my ailing pet. I gave him apple cider vinegar, switched him to wet food, and gave him what healing herbs I had around the house, but nothing seemed to help. My poor dog was laying on the couch with me, unable to lift his head, while I comforted him, spoon-fed him water and honey, preparing for the worst. Then a miracle happened. He lifted his head up, licked my hand, and tried to drink from the bowl of honey water I was holding. I was ecstatic. I had my beloved pet back. I fussed over him for a few days, continuing to give him the best care that I could, and his condition improved to the point where I didn't have to carry him out to the front, and now he wanted to go out in the backyard where he usually played and did his business. The next day, he died. About a month after my tiger-striped pup died, I got the phone call I didn't want to hear. It was Mud on the other end, and he was crying and saying it was over. He'd done something terrible to himself, and how I should just kill him. Instinctively, I asked him if he had hurt his child, and he cried and cried before groaning out a feeble, "No," and started begging for my help. When he came back to my house, it took 3 days of him crying about how he screwed his whole life up before I finally got him to tell me what happened. He told me he had punched a guy who had accosted Tina, and that he was now wanted by the police for assault. I took him to a lawyer and had him turn himself into the police, where he was arrested. The judge sentenced him to 1 year probation and 3 months house arrest. In my house. Oh Lord, why did they punish me for this? Unfortunately, I was soon to find out what punishment really is, because Colette walked back into my life. The past 4 years had not been kind to Colette. Her face had lost the girlish good looks, and her hair looked more appropriate on a fascist Richard Spencer than on any of the fairer sex, though it did match the swastika tattoos she had recently acquired. She plopped down on the couch beside me, rubbed my leg like old times, and told me that she was sorry to see that my dog had passed away, and that she wanted to comfort me, as she knew how much my little guy meant. My whole day brightened as I thought maybe Colette had matured, and that possibly we could have some measure of friendship between us, instead of the hatred the other exes had shown me in the past. I told her that I was more concerned about my dad. I had recently found out that he was suffering from an abdominal aortic aneurysm, which had turned over 6 inches of the main blood vessel from his heart into a balloon, and it could pop at any moment, killing him instantly. She just smiled at me and said that she wanted to play video games and kid like the old times, and how she didn't want me to be alone during this time. I felt a tear of joy forming in my eye, but alas, I was not alone. Mud came sliming his way up from the basement, and the old patterns of Colette's behavior began again. First the embarrassing stories started, then the mocking and the insults as Colette screeched in celebration of her total victory over all mankind. She showed me pictures of some of her recent 35 male victims and talked about how they were hardcore drug users. As she began fawning over Mud, what little of my heart I had saved for over the years of abuse died then and there. Sure enough, over the next few days, Colette and Mud began to disappear around the same time. I had told both of them not to do anything sleazy in my house, but they were both selfish, greedy monsters, and I knew what to do. I decided to become the predator, and all the training my dad had given me when I was a kid started to kick in as I set my trap. When the trap was sprung, the lying and squealing from these pigs would just not stop, but I would not relent as the prey was firmly in my jaws now. I bit down hard and cracked the bones of every lie they told me and chewed their hearts to pieces. When it was over and the truth was all known, Mud fled like a coward, leaving his so-called beloved swine to face my wrath alone. Colette spent her efforts between vulgarly spitting in my face and then wiping it off, saying, "Sorry, I didn't want to hurt you," in an effort to keep the door of my now non-existent heart open, in hopes of claiming victory in a battle she can never win. But the shattered and smoking ruins I had created out of these pigs was not enough for me. My house now cleared of the stain of Mud, I had then started to expose all the lies by searching the contents of his room, and that's when the first horror set in. All my hunches were right. Junky gear was everywhere among the rotting plates of food in his room. The floor was hidden by layers of garbage and dirty clothes, and I'd almost had a heart attack when I stepped on a used needle. Luckily, it did not penetrate my shoe. The foulest of all was the bloody, feces-stained, ripped condom I found. I mean, no man should have to clean that out of their house. Then I hit the second horror. Mud's arrest records. Guess what? It did not contain the name of the man he assaulted. It contained the name of the woman he assaulted. Tina. That scumbag Mud had gotten drunk and talked with pleasure about the power he felt from that assault. I didn't think it was sick at the time because I had assumed that he had hit a man and not the mother of his child. But he had smashed in the face of a tiny woman who was permanently disabled and unable to defend herself or her child from Mud's rage. I felt sick and betrayed. I had defended this piece of shit, and all the while he had been lying to me. A debt of honor needed to be paid, and these people need to learn what it is like to be defenseless. So I followed my hunch back to the source and called Nigel about his son's sexual history. He confirmed my suspicions, and then I had the great satisfaction of telling Colette that she had screwed a bisexual IV drug user with hepatitis. At least now she can't spread her poison to anyone else or destroy any men for at least the next 2 months, while she's waiting to see how many diseases she's contracted from screwing this junkie. The next morning, the final horror was revealed. I searched my backyard and found the half-empty bottle of antifreeze. A bottle of antifreeze that had no business being anywhere other than in the cupboard in my house. A bottle of antifreeze with a small hole punched in it, and the marks of where my once beautiful pup had chewed around the hole. A bottle of antifreeze Mud had put there when he thought he was never coming back. The next day, I hunted Mud down at the court-ordered anger management course he was ironically taking, and proceeded to smash his face into a pulp. I felt sublime joy in my heart as my fist repeatedly smashed into his vile face, and it was at this time that I realized the skeletal grip of my childhood abuser had slipped from my throat. In a rush, it came to me that all my life I had been attracted to abusive people. Now that I understood the source of my horror, my transformation was complete, and I had become the lion I always imagined myself to be. Now I'm with the people who I love and who love me. I'm with my father in the time of his need. But one thing is troubling me. The question nagging at the back of my mind as I think to myself, am I the monster now? I guess the best answer to that question is, maybe one good monster deserves another. Something Strange Lives Near My House by Anonymous Guy. So, this all started nearly a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, actually. I had some friends over at my house, and school had just started, and we decided we wanted to have a final chill session before school got too intense. We hung out together and played some on our computers till my parents went to bed, and then we snuck out. We went on a little adventure, smoked some weed, and after a few hours, we went on our way back home. We walked on the sidewalk of a big road, and this sidewalk has the road on one side and a fence on the other. The fence is pretty tall, maybe 10 feet, and it's barbed wire, and on the other side is just some really dense vegetation. While walking, I started hearing some twigs snap and leaves rustling in the distance. I asked my friends if they heard it, and they all said yeah, but it was probably just a squirrel. A really reasonable assumption. I ignored it, but the rustling started getting closer and closer. We could all hear it, and the rustling sounded as if something big was walking in the same direction as us. At this point, we were a bit unsettled, but we really weren't paying too much thought to it, since there is a huge fence between us, and realistically, what really could it be out there? After a minute of the rustling being maybe 20 feet away, I can't be accurate about it, but I'm just guessing on what it sounded like, it stopped. We kept on walking until suddenly the rustling was definitely no more than 5 feet away from the fence, and it was moving fast and sounded as big as a person. We could see the trees and bushes shake, but we couldn't see whatever the thing was. We got freaked out and ran to the other side of the road, not caring if there were any cars coming, and thankfully there weren't. After a while, though, we just mutually agreed that that was weird, and continued on doing what teenagers do until we went to bed. This was around 1 a.m. A couple of weeks after, I was hanging out with one of those 3 friends that I had had over that night. We did the same routine, this time sober, snuck out at night, and went on an adventure. As we were walking back home, we hit the start of the fence where that weird rustling happened. I told him, "Remember that time we heard the weird rustling sound? What do you think that could have been?" He says, "We were all pretty high. I mean, maybe it wasn't even real. Still kind of weird how we all heard the same thing, though." And in that moment exactly, I heard the most spine-chilling, inhuman shriek I have ever heard, literally coming from maybe a meter away from the fence. Our faces went pale, and we absolutely bolted. The cry we heard could not have been anything human or animal. There are coyotes in my area, but I've listened to recordings of their cries, and it wasn't anything like that. I don't know what this thing is, but I'm absolutely terrified, to go anywhere near there again. A Guy Named Mitch, submitted by Tina. After I graduated with a degree in communications, specifically public relations, I took a job out of state. As a matter of fact, I moved halfway across the states to take a job, as there were none in the area that I lived. I know, real bright. Get a job in a field that is not available in the town you're living in. Anyway, I had a blast, was living in New York for this job, and it didn't pay that much, but I got a lot of experience and met a lot of really cool people, and still have a lot of good friends that live there. However, after 3 years of working at this agency, I heard about a position from my parents with a local supermarket chain back home. They were looking for someone with my skills to work in their marketing department. The pay was a little bit higher, but in the Midwest, that kind of money goes a heck of a lot farther out there than it does in a place like New York City. I jumped at the chance and applied, and was lucky enough to have a friend who worked in management there. I was hoping I'd be a shoo-in. I did get a call for an interview and took vacation time from my current job and went back home, hoping that this prospect would work out and I could make a living back home. Without going into all the details, that's exactly what happened. I was hired, I quit my job, said goodbyes to my friends, and went back to my hometown. It was a cool job, but frankly the supermarket world is not as exciting as the ad agency world, and the clients that I worked with at my other job. But I didn't care. It was cool meeting all the people, and a lot of the programs that we did were focused on the community. After about 1.5 years, my boss decided to quit, and I was chosen to replace her. So, within a short while, I was now the main spokesperson for this chain. At least as far as community events went, I would prepare a lot of the material for the organization, the president and the board of directors, but they would always wheel me out to deal with the media when they didn't want to, which was most of the time. So because of this, I appeared in local newspapers as well as local television stations when we were promoting special events or sponsorships for community events. This wasn't all the time, but it was at least every other month on TV. And I tried to stay out of our promotional photos as much as possible, just like every good PR person does. However, after we launched a new partnership with a charitable organization and their upcoming gala, I led a small press conference in one of our stores before turning it over to the president of the company. This was our standard protocol. I would lay things out, set up the general statement, and then the president would make the official announcement, usually with an official from the other organization we were working with. So this press conference was just like any others that we had ever done. I stood off to the side to let the bigwigs do their thing, snapping pictures with my phone, getting them ready to go out on social media. That's when I noticed something that might have been sitting in the back of my mind for quite some time. The last few community events we held, there was this guy that was always there participating. I said it was in the back of my mind because lots of people show up at these things to volunteer or just be a part of it, but he had the whitest teeth I had ever seen, and I think that's what made him stick out. He was a pretty good-looking guy, so I didn't have that stupid notion that a lot of people do that homeless-looking people at hangout events like this are there to cause trouble or to walk off with as much free stuff as they can get. I know that sounds rude, but a lot of people in my organization looked at those folks that way, and quite frankly, we had to be on the lookout for them, as while most of them were harmless, sometimes a few were not, and would not only take the freebies, but also attempt to steal anything else they could get their hands on. So I saw this guy and didn't really do anything about it. I just kept doing what I was doing. But every once in a while, I would kind of glance over out of the side of my eyes, if you know what I mean. I couldn't help but notice that he was just staring at me. So we're wrapping things up, and I have to go to arrange for one-on-ones with the reporters and my president and the CEO of the other company. And most everybody else is either mingling and chatting for a minute before taking off, and I don't see the guy when I glance around as I was working. Finally, everyone left, the event was over, and I'm helping to clean up the things that we had brought out for the festival look. I felt someone behind me, and lo and behold, it's this guy. He's like 2 feet behind me and asks if I need any help. I turn around and take a step back, and then apologize and tell him, no, I've got it, but I appreciate it, and thanks for coming. I turned to go back to doing what I was doing, but he walked around in front of me and said, "My name's Mitch." I look at him for a second and say, "Oh, hi, Mitch. Again, thanks for coming." He just looks at me and says, "You're Tina, right? I recognize you from TV." I laugh and say, yeah, I've been on TV a couple of times. He says, "You're not from around here, are you?" And I say, "Actually, I am from here, but I did spend some time away from town." Now I'm thinking to myself, why am I telling him any of this stuff? He's a complete stranger. He doesn't say anything for a few seconds as I was still taking down some streamers and throwing all of our extra PR stuff in a box. "Do you have a boyfriend?" he asks, and I say, "Well, Mitch, I'm not trying to be mean, but that's really none of your business." And he says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I just wanted to ask you out for a coffee or a drink sometime." I told him that I was flattered, but I was really busy, and I didn't really have time for much social stuff in my life right now. He looks at me with these weird eyes and those giant white teeth, and says, "So you don't have a boyfriend?" And before I can respond, he just says, "Well, see you around. It was nice meeting you, Tina." He walked away, and I just stood there mulling over what the hell that meant. At the time, I just thought he was going to show up at more events in the future, but I was very, very wrong. The assistant in the marketing department was standing there, and I'll call him Jeremy, and he says, "Oh my God, that was awkward." I nodded and said, "Yeah," and he responded, "Well, you pretty girls attract all the weirdos," and started laughing. I laughed too, punched him in the arm lightly, and said, "Man, give me a break." Life went on, and I didn't think about Mitch because I was so busy with other things, and in fact, I had met a new guy and was in the beginnings of a relationship with him. It was still really early, only a couple of weeks in, so nothing super serious, but we did enjoy going out and having a good time. My little town doesn't have too much in the way of entertainment other than the usual stuff most towns have. A small mall, a movie theater, a couple of bars, but nothing that's like upscale like in New York. Nowhere in any flyover state is anything like a big city, and the biggest city closest to us was about 20 miles away. Anyway, this new guy, I'll call him Greg, was really cool. In the back of my mind, I really wanted to move the relationship forward, and after a month or so, we were still taking it slow. I guess I was okay with that too in retrospect. One night, we went to the city for dinner and drinks with some friends. Mostly my friends, as Greg was not from my hometown and really didn't know anybody. We had fun dancing, and everyone was getting to know Greg, and during a funny dance session on the dance floor, I looked into a mirror that was on the wall and stopped dancing immediately. And the reflection at the edge of the dance floor was Mitch. I mean, what are the odds of seeing that guy way out here, away from our town? I got off the dance floor, and Greg followed me, and I tried to point Mitch out and tell him the weird things that he had said to me at that press conference. Greg actually said, "Well, that wasn't really that weird, but at the same time, it wasn't Captain Smooth either. Maybe he's just an awkward guy and didn't know how to talk to you." I agreed, and we had another beer and just kept talking with our friends before it was starting to close. We knew he had to drive home, and Greg had been doing his best to not get too messed up as he was driving. We got out to his car, and he let me in on the passenger side, got in the driver's side, and looked over at me, and then kind of reeled back a little bit and hit his head on the window behind him. I looked at him and said, "What?" Turn around, and right in my window is the smiling face of Mitch. He gives the roll down the window motion, which is funny that people still do that, as I haven't seen a car like that with a crank handle for the window in a long time. I suppose that looks funny now, but at the time I remember thinking, what the hell is he doing? I tell Greg to just get out, and he does. He says he can still see Mitch standing in the parking lot in his rearview mirror. Well, we got back on the highway and headed for home. Now we started laughing about it, and I said, "I told you that guy was weird," and now finally Greg agreed. We were just listening to music and talking about what we wanted to do the following weekend, when a vehicle came up behind us with its brights on. It got right on our ass and filled our car with bright light. And then it started honking his horn, and Greg said, "Oh shit, what's this all about?" He drove this bright yellow Camaro and told me to hold on. It was pretty straight sailing all the way back to town, so he felt confident that he could go fast, and he did. That car could fly. We soon outdistanced whoever was behind us, and the lights faded, and after about 2 miles we didn't see them at all. I asked aloud, "Do you think that could have been Mitch?" Greg said maybe, but how could we tell? The rest of the evening was uneventful, and the next couple of weeks were just full of work and doing fun stuff on the weekends with Greg. That's when Greg got an email at work that just had in all capital letters, "Stay away from her." He didn't tell anyone at work, he just showed it to me, and I told him that he probably should tell somebody, even though it might be nothing. He said I was jumping to conclusions, but I thought it was odd. At any rate, he did, and someone pinged the IP from where it came, and one of the tech nerds narrowed it down and said it came from our town public library. Right after that, I started getting strange texts on my phone. It was from a number I didn't know, and it was just a lot of gibberish like word salad. Nothing made any sense, just a bunch of random words. I never responded and finally blocked the number, but it didn't matter because the same thing started to happen from a different number. The day after I blocked both numbers, I was at one of our stores looking to scout out cooler sections for a trade publication that wanted to take some beauty shots for an article they were writing. I was just writing notes and walking around and looking at things we would probably have to move for the shots to come off well, when I felt a hand on my shoulder. It took me by surprise, so I turned around to look into the face of Mitch. He just says, "Hi Tina, it's been a while, haven't seen you on TV." I just look at him dumbfounded and say, "Yeah, haven't really needed to do that in a while." And I immediately turned around and started working again, but I was also walking away from him. He followed me and kept trying to talk to me, and finally I just turned around and said, "Mitch, I'm working, you're gonna have to go away." That was really blunt and forceful. He just said "Okay, I'll see you around," turned and walked away. Now I was really weirded out. I went into the manager's office and called Greg. I told him that Mitch had just shown up, and he asked if I was okay, and I said I didn't really do anything, but it was just giving me the creeps. This was towards the end of the day, so Greg said he'd pick me up and we could go get a bite at one of our local Greasy Spoons. The store manager overheard me and asked what had gone wrong. I told him nothing and that things were going to be really awesome with this photo shoot, changing the subject. He said, "No, who's Mitch?" So I told him about how this guy had said something weird to me a couple of months back, showed up downtown, and then just showed up in the store here. He asked me, how could he possibly know you would have been here? And I said, I never thought of that. He told me he wasn't trying to freak me out, but I told him it was okay. And he said, hang on a second. And went to the video camera system we have for loss prevention. He started zooming through some of the tapes and said, "Isn't this your car?" And I said, "Yeah." On the video, a car pulled up next to mine, and guess who gets out? Mitch. He fast-forwards the tape, and it shows Mitch stopping at my car, trying all the door handles, then leaving a piece of paper under my wiper blade. Then he got into his car and drove away. And I must say, I don't know what he did for a living, but he had a very, very nice Jaguar. The manager told me to stay put and went outside to my car, and came back with a little envelope. He handed it to me, and I opened it. It had song lyrics in it that we had to look up on the internet. It was a song by John Waite called "Missing You." I guess he was big in the 80s or something. I had never heard of him. At this point, I thought maybe I should talk to somebody with the police because this started to get really odd, and I didn't want anything to be creepy like all the shows that I watch on TV. By now the red flags were there and the warning signs, but he had really done nothing to hurt me. Greg got to the store, and we showed him the tape and the note, and he said we probably ought to save that, but I think going to the police is probably overkill at this point. It took me a few minutes to agree with him, but it wouldn't be long before we did go to the police. The following week I did have to go back on TV to promote an event. It was extremely early in the morning, one of those morning shows, and I had to be at the station at about 10 to 6. I did the show, and thought I was going to stop for a terribly unhealthy breakfast at a coffee shop before I headed back to work. When I got out to the parking lot, I didn't notice it because it was parked on the side of the station, but there was a black Jaguar. I did notice it as soon as I got back onto the road in the dim light of dawn, though. I was driving down this pretty deserted road to get back onto a main road where I knew there was an open coffee shop, and I was also trying to one-hand dial Greg. As I was looking down at my phone, I didn't notice that the black Jaguar was now alongside me, and then pulled ahead, and I barely slammed on my brakes enough to not slam into it. Out pops Mitch, who runs around to the side of my car and starts banging on the window, asking if I got his note. I don't know what to say except scream out and yell, "Get away from me!" He tried opening my door, but obviously couldn't, so he ran around to the other side and tried that door. During this time, I'm screaming my head off and not reacting the way that I should. He keeps asking if I got the note. Did you get the note? Did you get the note? Finally, my senses came back. I dialed 911, jammed my car in reverse, and hit the gas as he jumped onto the hood of my car and started pounding on the windshield, screaming for me to stop. At one point, he actually formed a crack in my windshield and I could see that his hand was bleeding. He started screaming that he loved me and we were supposed to be together, and I'm screaming my head off too, realizing I can't keep going backwards forever, and it's getting dangerous because every time I look at him and then I look back, I'm starting to swerve like I can't keep doing this. So I slowed down, put it into drive, and started to speed up, but not so much as to hurt him because I didn't want to get in any trouble. I can hear the 911 operator from the speaker on my phone, and I'm desperately trying to jab at the speakerphone function. I finally get it to work, and I start screaming about this man who is punching my windshield and not telling the woman on the other end where I am or listening to any of the questions she's asking me. At this point, I take a chance and start swerving side to side to try to shake him off, and eventually it works because he screams one more time, "We're gonna be together!" I took off down the road, and in my rear view mirror saw him running for his car. I hit the main road and just started blasting away, trying to tell the 911 operator where I was and what had happened. I pulled down the first side street I came to, then pulled into someone's driveway right into their backyard. I figured Mitch would not be able to find me there. The guy came out of the house asking what the hell did I think I was doing, and I told him I was on the phone with 911, and he's looking at me like, "What the hell is your problem?" And I just scream out, "What is this address?" He finally tells me, and I tell the 911 operator where I am. She tells me to stay put. The owner of this house just kept asking if everything was okay, and I kept saying, "No, it's not okay, but I'm sorry I'm here." Finally, 2 police cars pulled up, and the officers started talking to me about what had happened. Obviously, they could see the windshield was damaged, and there were blood smears on it. I told them all about Mitch and all the weird stuff that had been happening, and they took everything down and then told me I should call my husband, boyfriend, or parents to come get me, as they were going to take my car to do a deeper dive into who might have been on top of the hood. They told me to come down to the station with them first and fill out a statement, and I had to do a whole bunch of paperwork and answer a whole bunch of questions. It was about 3 hours later when I could finally leave, and I remembered then that I had never even called into work. Funny how the mind works that way. My parents and Greg all came to get me, and we went back to my parents' place. A little while later, the police called my cell phone and asked if they could see the original note that Mitch had written to me, and I told them that I was at my parents', but it was at my apartment, and I could meet them there if they needed it right away. I didn't care at that point. I just wanted Mitch locked up or whatever they could do to him, because at this point I was scared. Greg drove me back to my apartment, and there was a detective waiting there for us in his car. When we got out, he did too and introduced himself. I had not met him earlier. I went to my apartment and unlocked the door and said, "I'll be right back. The note is in my room." Greg said that he needed to use the bathroom and he'd be right back too. As I was getting the note, I heard Greg yell out, "What the fuck?" and the door of the bathroom slammed shut. He yelled for the detective and said, "He's in there, he's in there." The detective said, "Who?" and Greg said, "Who the fuck do you think? Mitch is in the bathroom." The detective said to step away, went to the door, knocked on it, and said, "Mitch, if you're in there, I'm going to open this door and you're going to come out with your hands above your head, and you're going to do exactly what I say." There was no sound coming from the bathroom, and the detective repeated, "I want you to turn your back to the door, put your hands on top of your head, and walk backwards when you hear the door open." This time there was a little shuffling noise, and the detective, with his gun drawn, slowly opened the door, and out came Mitch, his hand all bloody. There was blood all over my sink, shower curtain, and in the tub. The detective got Mitch into handcuffs and got on his cell phone to call for an additional car. He took me outside, and as he walked by me, Mitch said, "This isn't supposed to happen." Well, as you can imagine, there was a lot more to do at the police station. More paperwork, more questions, and we got some answers right away. Mitch was a trust fund kid who was living in his parents' house after they had passed away and left everything to him. He didn't have a job. He didn't have anything in his life other than some expensive cars and a big house full of the latest toys any 25-year-old would want. Tons of stereo equipment, big screen TVs, pool table, all that stuff. It turns out, he was pretty mental. He had some serious issues that only got compounded when his parents died. He'd been living on his own since he was 19 years old and had no family and no real friends. He basically lived his life by himself. And from what he confessed to the police, he'd seen me on TV and decided that I should be his girlfriend, and in his world, that's what was going to happen. In a way, it was kind of sad. He was charged and convicted with a number of things that I don't feel like running on about in this, but he was placed in a social services facility, and as far as I know, he's still there. I continued to work for the supermarket for another 4 years before deciding to move to the West Coast for another opportunity. Greg and I went our separate ways, and I speak to him from time to time. When all this happened, though, I became a little more famous, not for my television spots for the supermarket, but for all of the reporters and stuff covering the story. Like I said, I have no idea what happened to Mitch, and I don't care. I do know that if he ever gets out, there is a restraining order that he has to follow, and if he violates it, he will go to prison. I'm very happy where I am now. I love living in Silver Lake, and have put this chapter of life behind me. My parents never bring it up. My friends never bring it up, and this is the first time that I've brought it up in a long time. When I visit home, though, I'm still a little paranoid. No matter what, every time I go back there, I'm always looking over my shoulder, thinking that I'm going to see that bright smile of Mitch. Hallway Fright, submitted by Mary G. In the mid-'80s, I was working as a nursing assistant at a large nursing home in Fort Worth, Texas, on the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. I was on my rounds at the far end of the hall, away from the nurses' station, and had just left the first room of my rounds, when my spidey sense kicked in really hard. I had chills from head to toe. The right side of my scalp, shoulder, and arm were nothing but goosebumps. I looked behind me and didn't see anything at first, so I continued up the hall, and when I came out of the next room, there was a thick gray fog, or whatever you want to call it, standing outside that first room I had come out of when my spidey sense kicked in. I couldn't freak out and go running and screaming up the hall because I didn't want to wake up the residents and look like a fool in front of my coworkers. So I finished my rounds, and when I got back to the nurse's station, the nurse on duty, I'll call her Terry, and another aide, Francis, wanted to know why I was shaking and pale. I told them what had happened. Terry said there used to be an old lady in that room who was very hateful and would fight with the employees, slapping and spitting on them. So it wasn't anything to go in that room or be in that hallway and see her spirit. This only happened that one time, but that was enough. Junkies at the Mall, submitted by Paul. I thought I would share this story to see if you'd read it. Back in the 80s, I worked in a record store in our local mall. It was outside of a Sears store, and this odd couple used to come in all the time. I was 19 at the time, and I'm an average-sized guy. There were these homeless-looking people, a guy and a girl, that always hung around the mall, like every day. They would wander through our record store and never buy anything, but would frequently ask us odd questions that we later figured out were to get us workers separated so they could steal. Stuff like, could they use the bathroom and things like that. As most people know, malls have public restrooms, and there would be no need to use a private bathroom if any of the stores actually had private bathrooms in the first place. To my knowledge, we didn't have anything like that. We had a back room and a hallway that was connected to other stores through their back rooms, but that was about it. If I wanted to take a piss, I had to go to the public restroom. One night, I was working, and it was getting close to closing, which was 9 p.m. back then. The couple had come in and was wandering around the store looking through records and tapes, and again, not buying anything, but asking weird questions. My coworker Dave was talking with the woman when she had some specific request about a record that I can't recall. He walked away with her to the section where that record would have been, while I was just doing store maintenance, fixing up the stacks, etc. With my back turned to the guy, I didn't notice that he was grabbing a bunch of tapes and stuffing them into his jacket. I was alerted to this by a third employee, a little woman named Danielle, who we called Danny. She was pretty tough and had no trouble confronting people who were out of line in the store. She was making this motion of putting something into her shirt, and I knew exactly what she meant. I nonchalantly walked to another section of the store, acting like I had no idea what he was doing. Danny started to make a move towards the guy, and I started to move towards him as well, so to speak cut him off at the pass if he tried to make a run out the front of the store. He must have known that the jig was up, because he did start walking quickly to the store entrance. I got up to him and grabbed him by the arm and said, "I don't think so, buddy." Danny had come up and kind of patted his jacket and said, "What do we have in there?" The guy stared at us crazily, and we could tell he was on something. I looked at him and said, "Look, man, normally I'd let you put the stuff back and just tell you not to come back, but this is not your first time doing this in this store. This time I have to call security." He tries to rip away from my grasp, and all of the tapes spill out from his jacket onto the floor. Danny goes to call mall security, as we didn't have police that took care of the mall. They would call the police and let them handle things with us telling them what had happened. So as Danny is making the call, this guy pulls out a buck knife and swings it at me. He catches my forearm and slashes it open, and I was surprised that the knife was as sharp as it was. I mean, this wasn't a scratch on my arm, it was cut. Of course I yelled out and let go, and he took off with his girlfriend in the back of the store screaming for him to come back. Dave was not letting her leave for obvious reasons, and Danny is now freaking out on the phone, telling them that I will also need medical attention. I took my shirt off and wrapped it around my arm and held it tightly, waiting for the help to come. Mall security gets there and starts questioning the girlfriend, realizing she hasn't really done anything that they can run her in for. But they do call the police, who show up to take a statement from me and also arrange for some medical treatment. It wasn't as bad as I originally thought, but I would need stitches, and they asked if I wanted an ambulance. Dave said he would drive me to the ER, and I moaned inside, knowing I was probably going to have to sit there for a couple of hours before they took care of me. That pissed me off more than anything. We gave them the description of the guy, and they told the woman she was no longer allowed in the mall, and if they found either of them there, they would arrest them both for trespassing, and she had better tell her friend that he would be facing charges for attacking me too. I got my arm looked at, and my boss was super cool and told me to take a couple of days off and he wouldn't charge me with vacation time. I look back at that job now and laugh because I think minimum wage was something like $3.18 back then. It's a far cry from the $15 everybody is demanding today. When I did get back to work a couple of days later, I found myself having to take a squirt. I let my coworkers know I'd be right back and went to the public restroom. As I did my thing, I went to wash my hands and then heard the door open. I didn't think anything of it because people come and go from the public restroom all the time. I mean, it was the middle of the day. But when I turned to use the air dryer, I found myself looking into the eyes of the guy who had cut my arm. He was standing there with the same knife open and was looking at me menacingly. He walked forward, kind of slashing the air a little bit, but with this really creepy grin on his face, and he started hissing about really fucking me up this time for getting him kicked out of the mall. I'm not much of a fighter, and never have been, but I knew that I had to do something here. I kept backing up away from him, telling him that he better put the knife down, or he'd be in way more trouble than he already was, but he just kept grinning at me and walking towards me. I remember this like it was yesterday, and I was thinking that I was hoping someone else would walk into the bathroom. In fact, I remember praying to God to have someone walk into the bathroom. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. I was running out of real estate behind me and thought, well, I'm going to have to take care of this on my own. The guy was walking towards me, and I just turned and jumped into a stall and closed and locked the door. Yeah, like that was going to do anything with this nut. He was now standing outside of the door, gently tapping on it, saying that he could wait there all day. I had no idea what to do. The only thing I could think of was to crouch down and see his feet and legs under the bottom of the door. I remember bracing myself on my knees against the toilet and reaching out for his legs. He obviously was not paying attention because he didn't move. And before he knew it, I had my hands around his ankles and pulled with all of my strength back towards me. He fell backwards and cracked his head very loudly on the tiled wall, and I jumped up and unlocked the stall door and made a break for the bathroom exit. When I ran back out into the mall, thank God there were 2 mall security guys who happened to be walking by, and I told them what had happened, and who was in there, and what he had done in our store, too. They went in and came out with him on either side, holding his arms, and he was going bananas. He lunged at me again and started trying to kick out at me, and they were having a heck of a time keeping him under control. I did see a little bit of blood on the back of his head as they took him away, and said that they would be coming to my store with the police and not to leave the mall. So, in a way, I kind of felt good that I did get a shot at him and return the favor of him cutting me with a knife. It turns out that he and his girlfriend were junkies and were always getting into trouble, not just at our mall. They were living a life of stealing shit to sell to keep their habits rolling, and basically were fried almost all of the time. No love lost with me. I was glad to see them both go. Total scumbags. I have a nifty scar on my forearm that will never be going away and that will always remind me about the time I had to fight back in a public restroom. I've never been in a fight since, and I don't think I'll ever find myself in a position like that again.